Good morning, everybody. Tom Kaczynski here. I want to welcome you to episode 31 of Coronavirus Central. Today's date is Tuesday, March 17th, 2020. Happy St. Patrick's Day to you all, and thank you for choosing Coronavirus Central for your news and views source for the ongoing pandemic. We thank all of our listeners. We appreciate you all, your stories about what you're overcoming, the information you provide, and those especially who participate in our open source intelligence network at Telegram. That's at t.me/coronavirus central. We also want to thank everyone who's been joining our YouTube channel. I won't even try to spell what it is. Just go to Coronavirus Central and click the link, or you can find the link on our Twitter at CoronavirusCast. Or there are plenty of links at Facebook as well, Coronavirus Central. So I want to thank everyone. We've got a lot going on today, so we're going to jump all over the place. Just give you a quick preview of what today's show is going to hold for you. We're going to look at some updates in terms of what's happening in Italy, amended recommendations for how to treat this. We're going to talk about airborne respiratory a little bit more, and ways to reduce fever and how that may impact the immune system. We're going to do a little deeper dive on a study that I think is highly relevant here. It was from February 18th, but it was talking about T cells, and we've talked a lot about this immunosuppressive capacity that we're seeing in COVID. And we're kind of taking a step back to take a step forward to understand why it is that certain people are getting sicker and trying to build a theory based on the evidence that's out there. So we're going to take a look at some of that and see if that will prove helpful to people. We have some really interesting modeling that came out of Imperial College. They have been advising the British government about how to succeed in this, and they have changed a number of their projections recently, which may lead to changes in UK policy. So we're going to start there. We're going to look a little more deeper about some of the policy problems, what's happening within the US and the UK. We'll talk about France's lockdown, San Francisco's lockdown, the federal response we're going to get into a little bit here, and the problems with that. And then we're going to go into the supply chain and a little bit more deeply. We're going to take a look at Amazon here near the end of the show, and maybe leave a piece of good news here to close it up. So before we go into that, just a quick monologue about this. Yesterday afternoon, I ended up doing an interview with the Daily Beast with a reporter, and they had reached out to me, and they were like, they wanted to talk about Coronavirus Central, and I'm always happy to go do an interview because I want to spread information about this. And what they basically wanted to do, just to make it very blunt, was they wanted to run a hit piece on yours truly. And I don't really want to mention that other than, we all come from places, we all work on things, but I just thought it was really funny that we had someone who had the opportunity to reach potentially millions of people with media, to go ahead and really put information out that would help and save lives. And what they wanted to do was get my opinion on tweets I'd made back in 2017. And I lit the guy up, and I have no problem with saying that. And, I'm not here to ask people to endorse a specific set of views other than to say this, that it seems to me as we go through this crisis, whether it's the media or the neighbor next door, whether it's our governments or, the people who are making decisions on Wall Street, we keep making one mistake that we need to stop making, which is we keep overlooking the virus. I had a really good chat last night in the YouTube chat, which we have Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 7 p.m. And a question a lot of people kept asking me was, who was responsible for the virus? Who's going to benefit from it? Who's going to come out the other side? Who can I trust in this? And the problem is, while those motive questions are important, and I don't want to take that away from anybody, we keep overlooking the virus. The fact is, this is a terrible virus that's going to kill some large number of people, probably well into the millions, given the anemic response, and that we keep thinking that we get past this and back to whatever fights we were having before. And I keep telling people, and this is the message of the show, that you have stepped into a new world where those old issues just don't matter the same way, because the reality is, as we will see today, coronavirus is reshaping every aspect of our life, from how our economies work to what our governments can do to how people live. And as time goes by, the ability to get access to medical services, the ability to get access to food supply. So for all those people out there who are listening and thinking about other issues, allow me to offer you this thought. If you refocus your life around the virus, if you refocus your life around this idea that what are you going to value, what are you going to change, how are you going to protect yourself, you will be a happier person, you will be a safer person, and I think ultimately you will be a more successful person. the many thousands of people who listen to the content on this and many other great shows were able to avoid the panic buying, avoid the risk of putting themselves at contamination, and will be prepared for whatever comes, whether it's a long quarantine or some other unexpected outcome, as best as we can be. And there's a calmness, there's a serenity that comes with that. So I don't get mad about, people having opinions. That would be ridiculous. People are going to have those, and that's natural and healthy. What I get mad about is when people in positions of authority don't take their responsibility seriously to look out for the interests of other people. And I would submit to you that that has been a big part of the problem with this, that people who are in leadership positions all over the place have been asking how coronavirus affects what they want to be doing rather than asking how coronavirus impacts the people. And that's really what the emphasis of this show is, will continue to be, and has to be. Because if we don't survive it together, we won't survive it at all. Because this is a virus where if 10% of the people get sick, even if they're 10% of the people that, we may not like or think about regularly or, want to think about, that's going to be the people who get the rest of us sick. And then we will basically be sort of treated like ping pong balls unto death. So stop worrying about what comes after the virus so much and worry about how you survive it. A day will come where we will work things out, and I suspect strongly that we will find that many things will change as we will look back on the world that allowed this to spread with fair criticisms of what went wrong and hopefully learn from these mistakes. But for us to even get to the chance to fix things, we have to survive what's happening now. Let's start by looking at the numbers at COVID-19info.live. Okay. This information, and I want to hit refresh here so it's as fresh as possible. Let's check what time we're showing us. So this is at 6:50 a.m. United States Eastern Time. We have 183,836 confirmed cases with 7,175 confirmed deaths. And they put a recovered number up, which I don't like to use because I find it really difficult because there have been things that have fallen out of that number. But just to give you an idea, that number up there is 80,046 cases, which is really heavily skewed by the Chinese numbers, so I don't have a lot of faith in it. But I'm going to, just for some countries that are in the lurch right now, give you the recovered number. China's at 8973, 3,226 deaths, with 68,689%, people recovered. And just to put a rate on that, they're claiming the death rate ended up about 4% and the recovery rate at 84.8%. Whether that's true or not, who knows. In Italy, which is in the midst of the worst of it, and I think is the first country whose statistics we can actually trust, we have 27,980 confirmed cases as of today, 2,158 deaths, a 7.7% death percentage, and 2,749 recovered cases. So 10% of the cases are recovered, 8% of the cases have died, and we have a lot of people in the lurch that we don't really know about. Now, some of those are presumably light, mild, asymptomatic cases. I would imagine, given the studies out there, that would be a very large portion of that, even though these numbers don't offer that level of detail. Something to keep a very close eye on, though, is the fact that recovery rate is very low. Iran, a country that also got hit very hard, 14,991. We think there's reporting issues there, but they do claim 853 deaths, that's about 6%, and 4,996 recoveries, and that's 33%. So we'll go to Spain, who is getting up there very fast. 9,942 cases with 342 deaths, that's 3.4%, and 571 recoveries, so that's 5.7%. So they're looking a little bit better than Italy as of right now, but they're getting newer into it, honestly. So we'll see. South Korea has 8,320 confirmed cases, 83 deaths, that's 1%, and 1,407 recovered, that's 16.9%. They were very aggressive about their tracking, so their number in terms of confirmations is likely more accurate, or at least has, I shouldn't say it's more accurate, but has a lot more in it. So Germany, 7,588 and 17 deaths, and these countries I'm just going to give you the confirmed and deaths because it's too early to try to figure out what this means for the healthcare systems. France, 6,655 cases, 148 deaths. U.S., 4,661, 85 deaths. Switzerland, 2,330, 21 deaths. and UK has 1553 with 56 deaths. And I'll just to give you a feel for the countries, all these countries have between 1,000 and 1,500 cases. Denmark, Sweden, Austria, Belgium, Norway, Netherlands, countries with over 500 cases, but less than 1,000. Malaysia, Japan, and then there's a whole glut of countries in the 300s. Australia's at 452 for our friends down under. Our listeners in Canada, 439, 4 deaths reported. Got a lot of Irish listeners, 223 with 2 reported, and I know your country went into lockdown on the 15th, so we'll see if they expand anything. They're looking at a travel ban over there. I also want to say, before I go any further, I want to give credit to the good people of Houston, Texas. I had a number of them inform me that the Houston rodeo has, in fact, been shut down and was shut down several days ago. I did not get that update. I'm glad that it happened. I want to congratulate the people of Houston for making a very good decision for their health care. And now I can take that city off my list and go back to hammering Florida every day, which I like to do. And it's just crazy. I have so many people who send me notes from Florida asking why they do what they do and what they don't do. And I can't answer you other than to say that someone is giving some really bad advice to that administration down there. So that's really troubling considering what an at-risk population we have. But Florida has a unique problem, which it both has the most vulnerable population and it's a state incredibly dependent on economic tourism. But I would suggest to Governor DeSantis that you take a note from Disney World and maybe start to shut it down a little bit down there for the health and safety of your own people. But that's decision, and the reality in this is how well things go depend on how quickly your government becomes aware of things. Unfortunately, there is a very high consequence for things not being understood quickly. I'm going to share one piece here from The Guardian in Italy. It's another one of those pieces about some of the people who are suffering very badly. I don't love sharing pieces like these because I really want to focus on what you can do. But the biggest thing we have to do now is increase social distancing, get people to stay home, and part of that is getting people to be aware of the consequence of this. There is a quirk in human psychology whereby people who do not experience a thing do not believe in a thing. And I see a lot of threads, comments, saying that, oh, this has to be a hoax or this isn't a big deal. Why don't I know anyone who's had it? Well, it takes a little while for exponential growth to happen. You don't end up being, overwhelmed in the first moment. It all happens at the end. And so I keep reporting these different stories from Italy, these human interest stories, so that you can understand that lots of people are getting sick from this, not just the at-risk communities. It's our people who are healthy who get sick, and that it is absolutely terrible and what it's doing to those who are in the medical system, both the patients who suffer this disease and the many physicians, nurses, and different aides attached to this who are putting their lives on the line and who are in a lot of cases, really difficult and trying situations to do that, both in terms of inadequate administration and insufficient protection. So let's go to Italy. This piece here we're going to have is by Angela Giuffrida in Rome, and it's titled, "This is Like a War, a View from the Italy Coronavirus Frontline. Friends and relatives of those killed by COVID-19 tell of the virus's devastating impact." And this was published today at 1 p.m. Their local, or I guess it's converted to my time. So this was literally just published about an hour ago. There are the elderly couples who died hours apart and without their families around them. There's the 47-year-old woman who died at home and who reigned there for almost 2 days because funeral companies refused to collect her body. There are the doctors who lost their lives after assisting their infected patients. And we saw that with the people dying at home with, was it not coronavirus? Oh, yeah, coronavirus in Wuhan. We saw that, and we're starting to see that in Italy now as well. People are quarantined. They can't go out. They're too sick to move. They're too sick, and they die in their beds. It's really sad. And I don't think China counted them among their numbers, to be honest with you. I'm really sure they didn't. Among the 2,158 people to be killed by the coronavirus pandemic in Italy as of Monday, the oldest was 95 and the 2 youngest were 39. The reality is this virus is spreading like wildfire. Death is not certain, but the contagion is real, said Luca Francesi, whose sister Teresa died at home, 47, on Naples on March 7th. My parents are heartbroken. They're destroyed, he told The Guardian. Teresa, who lived with her elderly parents, sister, brother-in-law, and 2 children, suffered from epilepsy, but was otherwise in good health. A week before she died, she came down with the flu. My parents called her doctor, but they refused to come to the house despite knowing she had a disability. She went into a coma on March 7th. We tried to call the emergency hotline. They arrived after 40 minutes. In the meantime, I tried to give her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Teresa tested positive for the virus post-mortem. Francesi spoke of his family's frustration at being abandoned by the authorities after his sister was left to die at home. It was only after he made an appeal for help via Facebook that a local funeral company eventually came to collect her body. But as with other coronavirus victims, she was buried quickly and without ceremony to mitigate the risk of infection posed by her corpse. Her parents, who have underlying health issues, tested negative for the virus, as did Luca and a nephew. The rest of Teresa's immediate family of 7 have tested positive. Silvio Brusaferro, the president of Italy's Higher Institute of Health, said on Friday that the average age of coronavirus victims was 80.3, with the majority having suffered underlying illnesses. The most common additional health issue was arterial hypertension, followed by chronic heart disease, atrial fibrillation, and cancer. More than 70% of those who have died were men. The 2 39-year-old victims were a man with diabetes and a woman with cancer. The vast majority of deaths have been in the northern Lombardy region, 1,420 as of Monday night, followed by Emilia-Romagna at 346, and Veneto at 69. But not all of the dead had other health issues, at least as far as is known. Luca Carrara lost his father, Luigi, 86, and mother, Severa Bellotti, 82, within a few hours of each other. He told the Italian press they were in good health. I was unable to see my parents. They died alone. That's what this virus is, he added. The truth is, this is not a banal flu, and if you end up in hospital, you leave either alive or dead. The couple lived in Albino, a town in the badly affected, should probably be Albino, a town in the badly affected province of Bergamo in Lombardy. The harrowing impact of the virus on the area can be gleaned from the obituary section of the local newspaper L'Eco di Bergamo. On Friday, reader Giovanni Locatelli shared online footage comparing the newspaper's obituary section on February 9th, when listings took up just one page, to a copy dated March 13th, when 10 pages were needed to commemorate the dead. In Codogno, the Lombardy town where the outbreak began, Enrico Palestra lost his 80-year-old father, Giovanni, who was otherwise in good health. It's not a normal flu like people are saying, Palestra told The Guardian. He declined to speak further. Another victim in Codogno was the 74-year-old uncle of Alessandro, who asked for his surname not to be used. He got a fever 5 days ago and died on Sunday, said Alessandro. He was in good form, didn't smoke, and had no previous illnesses. A good part of my family are sick with this illness. Alessandro, who lives in Lake Garda between Lombardy and Venice, added, people who don't live here don't realize how bad it is. We're hearing ambulances every half an hour as they take sick to the hospital. It's striking. What amazes me is that other countries are seeing these things, not only England, but have taken precautions too late or have not been decisive enough. This worries me. Several medics have died, among them Roberto Stella, the president of the Order of Doctors in Varese, Lombardy. The 67-year-old was tending the patients until he started to suffer symptoms and went into intensive care himself. He died last Wednesday. They are all doctors who had no fear going into combat, knowing the risks they were running, said Saverio Chiaravelle, the vice president of the Varese Doctors Order and a close friend of Stella. They died on the field, but when you are in combat, you don't imagine it could happen to you. The enemy is invisible, but this is like a war, and the only solution is to isolate. Those who have to work must work with precautions, and the rest must stay home. So I wanted you to hear that so you could hear just how bad it is. And, a lot of people ask, where is the evidence of the deaths? Well, I would submit to you that they don't increase the obituary section by 10, just for going out there and, trying to go ahead and sell something. People are talking about their families. You have real stories here of loss. And look, people aren't going to sensationalize death. I know people ask this, and it's a crazy question. Who would want to have the last picture, the last video you take of someone you love, who you're watching, or who are in a hospital, be of them in their absolute worst situation? I can speak to this. I came home to discover my mother had passed away. My father was weeping uncontrollably, and she had died of complications from emphysema. So I've been in this situation. It's not a situation where you're thinking, oh, how can I show this to the world? That's the last thing on your mind. The shock is overwhelming, and that's what we're dealing with here. The shock of it and the fact that people are trying to keep their chin up because everyone knows someone who's suffering. You don't want to, fixate on the negative. because it will be something that destroys you. And that actually, to me, adds a little bit of credibility as someone who's seen some of these things. So I think that that's, a good place to start. And we want to avoid people being in that spot. In this article, they were talking about the doctor up in Lombardy who was actually one of the people who died. What's his name? Dr. Stella, the president of the Order of Doctors up there. And it's been one of the things that's been an ongoing concern for this show and for, of course, the larger effort to treat this has been medical workers getting sick. So we're going to talk about that just for a moment here, that, one of the concerns I've had expressed to me by multiple sources in multiple states and countries and healthcare networks is that nurses and doctors are not only not getting protection, but they're getting bad advice about what's out there, what the risks are. They're being told this isn't airborne, this isn't something you need to look out for, both people who are general practitioners, as well as, believe it or not, in some emergency rooms and ICUs. Now, the network between doctors and nurses is helpfully spreading better information, and the supply shortages of personal protection equipment are very real, but we have to really work better to let our doctors know and our nurses know that they need to be protected, they need to be safe, and that they have procedures in place for this, because we can't afford those people to go down. We know the storm is coming and the wave is just beginning to build. But the WHO has been way behind this, and I want to share this item here. This is from CNBC.com. This was from, it looks like it was from 12:24 Eastern. Actually, they updated it at midnight today, so on the 17th. And this is by Berkeley Lovelace Jr., Noah Higgins Dunn, and William Foyer. WHO considers airborne precautions for medical staff after study shows coronavirus can survive in air. Now, we've known this for a month. The evidence has been out there for 3 weeks, and the World Health Organization is just getting this information out now. How they can be so far behind is absolutely crazy to me, but for whatever reason, the people who have been offering guidance on this have just been wrong behind the science, and maybe because they're expecting this to behave like other things, they keep making the mistake. And I would remind everyone, this is a novel coronavirus, so what does that mean? It's new. It might not do what we're expecting. So let's continue. I'm not going to read the whole article, but I just want to make this clear. The World Health Organization is considering airborne precautions for medical staff after a new study showed the coronavirus can survive in the air in some settings. The virus is transmitted through droplets or little bits of liquid, mostly through sneezing or coughing. Dr. Maria van Kerkhove, head of WHO's Emerging Diseases Zoonosis Unit, told reporters during a virtual news conference on Monday. When you do an aerosol generating procedure like that, like in a medical facility, you have the possibility to what we call aerosolize these particles, which means they can stay in the air a little bit longer. She added, it's very important that healthcare workers take additional precautions when they're working on patients and doing those procedures. And so they go through the different studies, which we've been talking about. I'm just going to pull out pieces here. Copper and steel lasts about 2 hours, and other surfaces it's longer. We've reported a study that you're looking at cardboard and plastic 24 hours, plastic a little bit less than that, I think 16 hours. And they're saying that ultimately, these were things that could have been responsible for the spread, and that would fit the evidence. So I'm glad to see WHO is improving in what they're doing, and I'm sorry that the people who are supposed to be in front of this are often the ones pulling up the train, and we just need to do better than that. So one big piece of science here, there was a number of stories that came out, and Dr. John Campbell put out a very good video on that if you want to check him out. You can actually see his work and a number of other ones at covidreport.net, a very good website that has links to a lot of useful information. I think it's worth watching. But what they were saying is the French health minister recommended the use of paracetamol for fever rather than ibuprofen or cortisone. So they don't want to go for a steroid or non-steroidal inflammation-reducing aid. It's called NSAID. So you want to avoid that class. And the reason there, and I'm going to read you a couple of things for this, but just to give you the short version, is there are issues with inflammation-reducing drugs and immunosuppressive function that are involved. So I'm going to read the experts for you, then I'll offer a little bit of commentary. But to put it in short, if you get a fever, right, and you can't get to the hospital, or if you're a medical practitioner in the hospital, to put this in super short versions, they're using things like Tylenol rather than Motrin or Advil to treat this because there are effects that they want to avoid, and we'll get into those right now with some of the scientists. We'll start with Professor, and this is from the Science Medical Center, and this is expert reaction, which I think is useful. It gives you a couple different professional takes on why this should be the case, and we want to make sure that you don't worsen things when you get this, because realistically, the problem in the longer term with this is you don't want your immune system to be overrun. And if you allow that to happen, that's when the deep lung infection happens. It leads to a lot of the other really nasty symptoms, including organ failure and frankly, death. So let's try to avoid that. Okay. This is from Professor Paul Little, Professor of Primary Care Research, University of Southampton. Assume that's in the UK. There's now a sizable literature from case control studies in several countries that prolonged illness or the complication of respiratory infections may be more common when NSAIDs are used. And every time I say that, I'm just think in your mind that's ibuprofen to make it easier. It's a whole class, but that will probably save you some time. Both respiratory or septic complications and cardiovascular complications. The observational evidence is always difficult to interpret due to the so-called protopathic bias confounding by indication. That is to say, were the NSAIDs prescribed at an early stage of the complications developing, and so the NSAIDs use reflects the complications of a more severe illness rather than causing it? So they're just trying to say that what the impact that the drug has versus the help we hope to be had. Because a lot of times the challenge for doctors in assessing these things is at different points in the stage of an illness, different treatments may be called upon. And that's been one of the challenges of developing protocols because of our difficulty of understanding this as a disease that has different phases in it. But we've been trying to provide some evidence to help with that for both doctors and individuals to be prepared. But where this has been controlled, associations still persist. The finding in 2 randomized trials that advised to use ibuprofen results in more severe illness or complications helps confirm that the association seen in the observational studies is likely to be causal. Advice to use paracetamol is also less likely to result in complications. So he has a list of studies you can see here. And there's other ones here. We'll read one more. This is from Professor Ian Jones, virologist at the University of Reading. The advice relates to ibuprofen's anti-inflammatory properties, that is to say, it dampens down the immune system, which may slow the recovery process. In addition, it is likely, based on the substantial literature around the first SARS virus and the similarities between this new virus, that the virus reduces a key enzyme which part regulates the water and salt concentration in the blood and could be part of the pneumonia seen in extreme cases. Ibuprofen aggravates this while paracetamol does not. It is recommended that people use paracetamol to reduce temperature if you are feverish, So they're saying use Tylenol. Dr. Tom Wingfield, a senior clinical lecturer and honorary consultant physician, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. In the UK, paracetamol would generally be preferred over non-steroid or anti-inflammatory drugs, that's ibuprofen, such as ibuprofen, to relieve symptoms caused by infections such as fever. That is because when taken according to the manufacturer's and or health professionals' instructions, in terms of timing and maximum dosage, it is less likely to cause side effects. Side effects with NSAIDs, such as ibuprofen, especially if taken regularly over a prolonged period, are stomach irritation and kidney stress, which can be more severe in people who already have stomach or kidney issues. It is not clear from the French minister's comments whether the advice given is generic good practice guidance or specifically related to data emerging from cases of COVID-19, but this may become clear in due course. It should also be noted that in the UK, we would not commonly use cortisone to relieve infection-related symptoms such as fever. And there's a whole bunch of these you could just go through. But they're basically just saying that it could cause problems to the kidneys and it can suppress your immune system. So, and we know that we've seen actually with this, there have been reports that there can be some kidney damage, and that we've reported on the lymphopenia, the reduction of the white blood cell count, that has been a piece of how we could actually assess this disease. So one of the things I wanted to do was, this is a longer piece, and I'm not going to cover all of it in exhaustive detail, but I think it's important for medical researchers, so I'm going to take a step back and read a piece that was published on February 18th. We're going back to look at some of the things we saw early with respect to the infection out of Wuhan. And this piece is called The Reduction and Functional Exhaustion of T cells in patients with coronavirus disease 2019. Bo Diao and a host of other Chinese researchers were involved with this from, let's see what university they're from here. It just takes a minute to upload. These are from the a bunch of the hospitals actually in Chongqing and Wuhan. So this is from first-hand sources from the heart of the infection. I'm going to read the abstract to you, and then I'm going to read the discussion from it. It's a 14-page study, and frankly, it's pretty technical, so I don't really want to cover everything, but I do want to give you a flavor for it. For those who study this more closely, I think it's definitely worth looking at, and it's probably a key piece of the puzzle about what's happening. Now, coming into this, we have speculated that one of the reasons why there has been such effectiveness of the COVID virus is that we have seen the immune system unable to fight this off. That's a basic thing you'd expect. But we thought, there could be interaction happening where the ACE receptors were also being infected on the actual antibody sites. And what we find here looking at this with the T cells who are marking these is that we are seeing a slightly different pattern emerge where basically the virus is exhausting the capacity of the immune system to offer resistance, which is a little bit different mechanism, which may have some telling features. So I'm going to put the evidence out there more. You're going to get a little less commentary from me because we're getting to the limits of my own abilities of medical knowledge as quickly as I'm trying to put it together. But to offer a broad summation, what we are looking at in this study is we're asking the question of why the antiviral immunity is being suppressed, what's getting people sick, and what might be the mechanism. And I purposely included this article after ibuprofen because the reason why the French minister may have suggested not to use the ibuprofen or any of these NSAIDs is that what's happening is that that's further suppressing the immune function. And if you suppress the immune function too much while you have a virus, what will happen is the virus will overwhelm the body, and that will lead to organ failure, increased severity of sickness, and potentially death. Obviously, we don't want that. So let's go into the abstract of this. This is from MedArchive, and we'll put the links up for all of these things, as we always do, at coronaviruscentral.net and in the YouTube channel. Background. The outbreak of coronavirus 2019 caused by severe acute respiratory syndrome 2, SARS-CoV-2, has posed great threat to human health, which has been declared a public health emergency of international concern by the WHO. T cells play a critical role in antiviral immunity, but their numbers and functional state in COVID-19 patients remains largely unclear. Methods. We retrospectively reviewed the total counts of T cells, CD4, CD8, T cell subsets, and serum cytokine concentration from inpatient data of 522 patients with laboratory-confirmed COVID-19. And just so you understand what they're saying, they're talking about different sorts of cells that are used as part of your immune response. Some of the details will come in. Some of this is just going to be a little fuzzy, and I apologize. Admitted into two hospitals in Wuhan from December 2019 to January 2020, and 40 healthy controls who came to the hospital for routine physical examination. In addition, the expression of T-cell exhaustion markers, PD-1 and TIM-3, were measured by flow cytometry in the peripheral blood of 14 COVID-19 cases. Results. The number of total T cells, CD4 and CD8 T cells, were dramatically reduced in the COVID-19 patients, especially among elderly patients, those over 60 years of age, and in patients requiring intensive care unit. Counts of total C cells, CD8 or CD4 cells, lower than 800 microliters, 300 microliters, or 400, or I should say per microliter, respectively, are negatively correlated with patient survival. Statistical analysis demonstrated that T cell numbers are negatively correlated to serum IL-6, IL-10, and TNF-A concentration, with patients in decline period showing reduced concentrations of those and restored T cell counts. Finally, T cells from COVID-19 patients have significantly higher levels of the exhausted level or marker PD-1 as compared to health controls. Moreover, increasing PD-1 and TIM-3 expression on T cells could be seen as patients progressed from prodromal to overtly symptomatic stages, further indicative of T cell exhaustion. So what they're saying there is as your T cells get rocked, what ends up happening is you become symptomatic. So that one of the key things that they were observing in this study was that as the virus extended, it was having an active immunosuppressant function, where it wasn't just it was trying to infect things in your body. It was literally trying to exhaust how the T cells work. And the mechanisms of this aren't exactly clear, but here's what their conclusions are. T cell counts are reduced significantly in COVID-19 patients, and the surviving T cells appear functionally exhausted. Non-ICU patients with total T cells and CD8 and CD4 T cells counts lower than 800 per microliter, 300 per, and 400 per, respectively, may still require aggressive intervention even in the immediate absence of more severe symptoms due to a high risk for further deterioration in condition. So what we're going into is we're going into that first stage of the sickness. We've talked about the last stage, where basically your lungs are collapsing and ventilators are keeping you alive. That's what we're beginning to prepare for as the worst case scenario. And we've looked at this early stage that, where we have this thing that's like a flu, it's a cough, and the governments are telling you to stay home. But now we're looking at the stage of what happens that converts someone from being a light, potentially, a person who has this not as severely, and a person who has an acute case, on the theory that there are a number of acute severe cases that could, with proper medical intervention, not get into bigger trouble. One thing we've talked about that we can all do is that we would want to make sure we increase social distancing so we could prevent exposure to virus load. I spent a lot of time the last couple of shows talking about this idea of titer and this idea that if you get infected from multiple vectors at once, you give your immune system a lot less opportunity to have a response. That's why even inadequate protection is better than no protection, because less infection is more time for your body to act. This story about ibuprofen, another thing, you don't want to have anything that's immunosuppressive if you could help it. And if you are a patient or a person who is either has or is going to be exposed to people who are immunosuppressive, understand that they are at far higher risk. That's what this is saying. But now we're going to look a little bit about how that happens in the body. And like I said, it's a 14-page study. I'm not going to read all of it. I am going to read the discussion so that you have the opportunity to get the benefit of their conclusions. And I will say that having read the study, it looks like they did a lot of detailed research about what happened and why certain issues happened and why they were trying to facilitate the sort of cytokine response that you would seek. And when we're talking about cytokine, what we're really talking about is the expression of, and I'll just use this actually, of a healthy and vigorous immune system resulting in the release of 150 known inflammatory mediators, right? So what we're really trying to do here is make sure that we are able to fight this off. And cytokines specifically, I'm just giving you definitions here, are a large group of proteins, peptides, or glycoproteins that are secreted by specific cells of the immune system. They're signaling molecules that mediate and regulate immunity and inflammation. So what are we trying to do here? What we're trying to do is we want the immune system to be very active so that they can fight us. But like anything else, cells require energy, and that's the case with cytokines as well, that they require a lot of energy. And what appears to be happening, according to the study, is that cytokine production is down, and these cells' ability, they basically just have to work so hard they get exhausted. And so apparently that's part of the microbiology of this, and an area where we need a lot more research to understand what is the mechanism by which this is happening. Our theory had been that it was involved with the ACE2 receptor, and as I've been reading this report in some detail, they suggest that, in fact, that's not what's happening, at least with this element of the immune system. So why it is immunosuppressive to the T cells and the mechanism by which that works will be a key part in developing a treatment that works, and maybe can explain in part why ibuprofen does not without greater risk, because obviously you're decreasing inflammation, which has certain value in terms of patient comfort and in terms of cell damage, but you're doing it at the expense of weakening your immune system, allowing the virus to have a strategic edge. It's a poor defense. And that's why they said to use Tylenol. Okay, discussion. T cells play a vital role in viral clearance, with CD8 cytotoxic, and that just means cell killing, T cells capable, and they call these CTLs, so if you hear that, that's what this is, capable of secreting an array of molecules such as perforin, granzymes, and IFNY to eradicate viruses from the host. At the same time, CD4 helper T cells can assist cytotoxic T cells and B cells and enhance their ability to clear pathogen. However, persistent stimulation by the virus may induce T cell exhaustion. So what they're doing is they're making the immune system work too hard. This is the cytokine storm effect we've talked about. that can sometimes happen where you have almost, what's it called, antibody-dependent enhancement, where the body has too much of a response, and that can be too violent, and then the response gets, how should I say, it gets overwhelmed from the amount of energy consumption required, and the fact is the cells can't do their job. I mean, it's very hard. You can have too much of an immune response or too little of an immune response. Too little of an immune response, the virus gets through. Too much of an immune response, what happens is it starts causing damage to the body. You almost have to get into this Goldilocks zone. And it's actually really fascinating to learn this stuff. It's worth taking some time to educate yourself because, this is, and you can understand it. You just have to get past the words and understand the concepts. And I'm sure there are doctors like Dr. Campbell, Dr. Mertensen that do a good job getting this out there, as well as others who I just don't know. Okay, so let's continue here. Earlier studies have been unclear regarding the numbers and function of T cells in COVID-19 patients, albeit with suggestions of depressed lymphocyte counts. In this report, we retrospectively reviewed the numbers of total T cells, CD4, CD8, and T cell subsets in a total of 499 COVID patients. In non-ICU patients, we found that over 70% of the cases underwent decreased in the total T cells, CD4 T cells, and CD8 T cells. However, in the ICU group, a total of 95% of the patients showed a decrease in both total T cells and CD4 T cells, and most importantly, all of the patients displayed decreases in CD8 T cells. We also analyzed non-ICU patients in greater detail and found that aggressive intervention may be necessary to preempt the development of severe severe symptoms in patients with low T cell counts. Cytokine storm is a phenomenon of excessive inflammatory reaction in which the cytokines are rapidly produced in large amount in response to microbial infection. The phenomenon has been considered an important contributor to acute respiratory distress syndrome and multiple organ dysfunction syndrome. And we've seen this, organ failure and acute respiratory distress syndrome, as common elements of patients who get really sick. It has also been implicated in the setting of respiratory viral infections such as SARS 2002, avian H5N1 influenza virus in 2005, and H7N9 infection in 2013. Huang et al. Showed that the levels of IL-2, 7, 10, TNFA, GCSF, IP10, MCP1, and MIP1A were significantly higher in COVID patients. And these are markers for the exhaustion through extractions, or I should say excretions, through these T cells. So consistent with this report, we see here also find that the secretion of cytokines, that's to say things that were being used by the cells by the immune system to prompt a response, including TNFA, IL-6, and IL-10, was increased in COVID-19 patients. Interestingly, the numbers of total T cells, CD4 and CD8 T cells, are negatively correlated to the levels of TNFA, IL-6, and IL-10 respectively, suggesting these cytokines promote T cell decrease in COVID-19 patients. TNFA is a pro-inflammatory cytokine which can promote T cell apoptosis via interacting in apoptosis. Is going to be cell death that we're talking about that happens virtually the normal thing. I mean, the system has to ratchet down its T cells or you'd have problems, right? So that's what happens. But in this cytokine, what we're seeing is it actually you may be having your immune system kill some of its own cells prematurely, or in a way that's not helpful. Prematurely is not the right word, but that you have these confused signals that end up leading the body to make wrong judgments. So continuing, like I said, TNFA is a pro-inflammatory cytokine which can promote T cell apoptosis via interacting with its receptor, TNFR1, which expression is increased in aged T cells. So older people may be having a more adverse inflammatory response, or not inflammatory, immunological response. So our current analysis demonstrated that patients over 60 years old have lower T cell numbers, indicating that TNFA may be directly involved in inducing T cell loss in these patients. IL-6, when promptly and transiently produced in response to infections and tissue injuries, contributes to host defense through the stimulation of acute phase responses or immune reactions. Dysregulated and continual synthesis of IL-6 has been shown to play a pathological role in chronic inflammation and infection. And it's just saying that your body's bringing the wrong weapons to the fight. That's to make this real simple. So this one's really hard to pronounce. Tocilizumab, a humanized anti-IL-6 receptor antibody, has been developed and approved for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis and juvenile idiopathic arthritis. Moreover, tocilizumab has been shown to be effective against cytokine release syndrome resulting from CAR T-cell infusion against B-cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Whether it can restore T-cell counts in COVID-19 patients by suppressing IL-6 signaling remains uninvestigated. So this is actually really interesting. There is a drug here that we are talking about that needs a better name so I can pronounce it, but we'll just call it tocilizumab, and I'll spell it for you so that you can look it up if you're curious. Tocilizumab. That maybe there's the chance to go ahead and help our bodies have a more intelligent immune response and to fight some of the virus's exploits. So maybe there's a path of research there that we're not even talking about that could be really relevant. I haven't seen anything on it. I'll take some more look, and if I see something, I'll let you know tomorrow. And for the medical research, I know there's a lot of them out there. Go out there and see what this does. Hopefully it'll help. One interesting question is the source of these cytokines during COVID-19 infection. Well, previous studies have validated that the secretion of cytokines, including IL-6, IL-10, and TNFA, were mainly from T cells, macrophages, and monocytes, etc. Based on our results, we suggest that the secretion of these cytokines does not originate from the T cells. However, the cytokine storm in turn may promote apoptosis or necrosis of T cells. Apoptosis is sort of the healthy way of it dies. Necrosis is the overwhelming of it, where, cell death, you recognize necro, and consequently leads to their reduction. Our previous work demonstrating that monocytes and macrophages can produce pro-inflammatory cytokine during murine hepatitis versus virus strain 3 infection, and whether SARS-CoV-2, that's COVID, also triggers cytokine release from monocytes and macrophages in COVID-19 patients needs further investigation, and such work is in progress in our hospital, and I'm trying to find it. T-cell exhaustion is a state of T-cell dysfunction that arises during many chronic infections and cancer. It is defined by poor effector function, sustained expression of inhibitory receptors, and a transcriptional state distinct from that of functional effector or memory T-cells. By FAC's analysis, we found that both CD8 T-cells and CD4 T-cells have higher levels of PD-1 in virus-infected patients, particularly when derived from ICU patients. Since these changes could also be observed in our longitudinal follow-up of several patients from prodromal to ICU care, IL-10, an inhibitory cytokine, not only prevents T-cell proliferation, but also can induce T-cell exhaustion. Important blocking IL-10 function has been shown to successfully prevent T-cell function in animal models of chronic infection. We demonstrate here that COVID-19 patients have very high levels of serum IL-10 following SARS-CoV-2 infection, while also displaying high levels of the PD-1 and TIM3 exhaustion markers on their T cells, suggesting that the IL-10 might be mechanistically responsible. The application of potent antiviral treatments to prevent the progression to T-cell exhaustion in susceptible patients may thus be crucial to their recovery. That's your remdesivir type class and a lot of those antivirals that are basically designed to offer decoys so that your immune system doesn't have to get all the viral load. That's what those do, actually. So you can understand the different paths of treatment. That the remdesivirs, trifanavirs, all that, those are the decoys in this. That the chloroquine is the blocks and the locks, right, that we're talking about here, and that now they're saying, that we could maybe do something where we can go ahead and tell the immune system, no, this is what you need to do, and that's kind of where they're going with this. So, the application of potent antiviral, we have read with great interest the successful application of remdesivir to curing a COVID-19 patient in the U.S. and to clinical trials which indicate it may have significant potential as an antiviral. Taking together, we conclude that T cells are decreased and exhausted in patients with COVID-19. Cytokines such as IL-10, IL-6, and TNFA might directly mediate T-cell reduction. Thus, new therapeutic measures are needed for treatment of ICU patients and may even be necessary early on to preempt disease progression in higher-risk patients with low T-cell counts. So all of this study is asking the question, it's saying, okay, so the T-cell counts go down, how do we go ahead and get in there and make them stronger so that the body has the opportunity to act before this severe infection becomes acute? Because now we have a body of research saying that when the upper respiratory infection becomes lower respiratory and you have the alveolar filling up the ground glass opacity, at that point that's reached, it seems like the ability to effectuate an immune response is far suppressed, and part of that has to do with where your immune response is located. You're going to have a heavier version of it in the areas closer to the external world, and the other part of it, of course, is the fact that by the time it gets down into your lungs, if this study and other ones we've talked about with the lymphopenia apply, your system is functionally too exhausted to fight back, and now you have machines keeping you alive until some combination of drugs brings you back, or you get stuck on the ventilators and people don't come out of it because, you do have that thing of, fibrosis, you have, death, you have organ problems and failures. And that sort of trauma can have long-term consequences, even for people who leave the hospital. We've reported on stories from China and other places where people were in the hospital, they were declared cured after a long course of ICU treatment, and that they experienced organ failure. And is it related to this, just the damage and the loss of function and capacity? That's very possible. So, an important study, definitely going to put out there for you to have the opportunity to read that and to share that liberally. And for those who are medical researchers, I would suggest that it's worth taking a look into this part, especially about the tocilizumab, about what that could maybe do as a potential helpful treatment in maybe helping to allow the immune function, especially in older people where it seems like the expression is much reduced, to be able to not see an adverse cytokine reaction inside the immunological construct. God, I'll tell you the funny thing. Let me just interject for one minute. I never wanted to be acting like a doctor, man. And look, I'd be the first to tell you I'm not a medical researcher, but I've had more doctors and surgeons tell me than not I get the gist of it right, and they're kind enough to correct and educate me, and I am very grateful for their help. But, we got to figure this out. All of us have to step up our case, and so I give you this information. What's the takeaway for you, the person at home, that your immune system might get suppressed? Don't take ibuprofen, take Tylenol, and that if you are in that spot, you're going to want to try to keep your load down as much as possible. Hopefully, medicine will catch up. People are looking at it. They're working on it hard, and we continue to be part of that solution. So, we have new modeling out from the Imperial College about non-pharmaceutical interventions. It's a 20-page study. A lot of people are reading it. A lot of people are talking about it. Niall Ferguson, who's been involved with the government response over there in the UK, was with it. And one of the things that's been coming out, there's other surrounding stories, big controversy, you can look at them. We've been reporting about the UK's idea that they were going to go rush to herd immunity. And we've been reporting a lot on the UK response because, frankly, the UK at least has a coherent response, which is more than we've been getting from the United States. And I think it's indicative of how governments are thinking because, frankly, I think our government has been not very transparent at all. And so we're having to use other sources for the large American audience who listens to this. And for the large, frankly, the UK is our second largest audience. So we definitely want to talk about what's happening there anyway. So what they were doing was they were using a series of projections that they think were a little bit too optimistic in thinking that this did behave more like the flu, that's to say COVID, and now they're looking at it differently and saying that there are problems. And this analysis really goes into the question of the value of mitigation versus containment and the social costs involved in terms of what you would expect in terms of deaths in life in this. And so it's a really interesting study. It's definitely worth taking the time to read. I will post a link to it so you can read it. But in the interest of time, we're going to just go to the discussion portion of it, which will lead to basically their conclusions. It's about 2.5 pages. But it does offer some thinking for what you should expect because this is the playbook from which the UK government will be running their response. And what they are reporting seems consistent with what we are observing around the world. So let's go into it. And like I said, the authors of this are Niall Ferguson, a whole bunch of people. So this is on behalf of the Imperial College COVID-19 response team who worked in collaboration with WHO Collaborating Center for Infectious Disease Modeling, the MRC Center for Global Infectious Disease Analysis, the Abdul Latif Jameel Institute for Disease and Emergency Analytics, and of course, we mentioned the Imperial College in London. So I think what I want to do is, I'm going to read the summary and then I'm going to read the discussion. So the summary is, the global impact of COVID-19 has been profound and the public health threat it represents is the most serious seen in a respiratory virus since the 1918 H1N1 influenza pandemic. Here we present the results of epidemiological modeling, which has informed policy making in the UK and other countries in recent weeks. Let's see, I lost this stupid thing here. In the absence of a COVID vaccine, we assess the potential role of a number of public health measures, so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions aimed at reducing contact rates in the population and thereby reducing transmission of the virus. In the results presented here, we apply a previously published micro-simulation model to two countries, the United Kingdom, that's to say Great Britain specifically, so I guess they're excluding Northern Ireland, and the United States. We conclude that the effectiveness of any one intervention in isolation is likely to be limited, requiring multiple interventions to be combined to have a substantial impact on transmission. Two fundamental strategies are possible. A, mitigation, which focuses on slowing but not necessarily stopping epidemic spread, reducing peak healthcare demand while protecting those most at risk of severe disease from infection. And B, suppression, which aims to reverse epidemic growth, reducing case numbers to low levels and maintaining that situation indefinitely. Each policy has major challenges. We find that optimal mitigation policies, that is, combining the home isolation of suspect cases, home quarantine of those living in the same household as suspect cases, and social distancing of the elderly and others at most risk of severe disease might reduce peak healthcare demand by 2/3 and deaths by half. However, the resulting mitigated epidemic would still likely result in hundreds of thousands of deaths in health systems, most notably intensive care units being overwhelmed many times over. For countries able to achieve it, this leaves suppression as the preferred policy option. And I would just note that we've been talking for about 3 weeks about this ICU problem as one of the key elements that we thought was going to be a systemic problem. And the UK now seems to be at the same spot. I've drawn similar conclusions. But one thing that's interesting, and they say here, within the mitigation thing, is if you can get the at-risk populations to not be out there, you can go ahead and potentially cut off half of the at-risk numbers. I think that's a really important and huge number, and it should inform your expectations of what policy will evolve to. If you are someone who is over the age of 60 or perhaps 65 in the United States, you may very well be asked and required to stay home because you are someone who, by your very nature, through no fault of your own, the nature of how your immune system evolves over time will be a high-risk identified patient, and we would ask that you would do that anyway because really it's not to your advantage to get sick, it's not to anyone's advantage, but I understand that there are stresses involved with that. So let's continue. We show that in the UK and United States context, suppression will minimally require a combination of the social distancing of the entire population, home isolation of cases, and household quarantine of their family members. This may need to be supplemented by school and university closures, though it should be recognized that such closures may have negative impacts on health systems due to increased absenteeism. They're saying people not showing up, and that's one thing, not people really can't factor in properly the number of people who don't show up, and that's going to be a big number, frankly, because especially in the United States, perhaps more than the UK, because our system is so all over the place with all the things that it's doing that it's very hard for people to go forward and safely be able to be a part of this solution, and I'm very sympathetic to that. Let's go ahead. The major challenge of suppression is that this type of intensive intervention package, or something equivalently effective at reducing transmission, will need to be maintained until a vaccine becomes available, potentially 18 months or more, given that we predict that transmission will quickly rebound if interventions are relaxed. So there you see the UK saying 18 months maybe of quarantine. We show that intermittent social distancing triggered by trends in disease surveillance may allow interventions to be relaxed temporarily in relatively short time windows, but measures will need to be reintroduced if or when case numbers rebound. Last, while experience in China and now South Korea show that suppression is possible in the short term, it remains to be seen whether it is possible long term and whether the social and economic costs of the interventions adopted thus far can be reduced. And what they didn't say here, but that I guarantee you happens when they're sitting in the room with the private conversation, is can we go ahead and have our economy shut down for 18 months and have our society survive? or are we better off having these people, accepting the hit on the chin? And I guarantee you, even though the doctors are kind enough not to say here, when they sat there at 10 Downing with Boris Johnson and they were having that conversation, or if you prefer in the Situation Room in Washington, that's exactly the conversation they've been having, because the reality is survival isn't just a matter of not getting sick. It's also a matter of health that requires a lot of things to go right, especially in our society where we have a lot of comforts on which people tend to rely, not the least of which being food. And we're going to talk about food supply more and more, and we're going to have a lot on that today. But that's the introduction to this study. So let's go to the details of what they have in there. And they have a lot of details about different ways to go about it, methods, there's charts, there's modelings, predictions for different deaths. And I'll let you take a look at it under different modelings. I'm not so concerned with looking at what these exact are, and they do it with different predicted R-naughts. And just so you know, their R-naught for prediction here is about 2.6. So I would suggest to you that their transmission number is wrong by orders of magnitude, and that they are responding and starting to figure out, but now they have a framework that they can plug that in. And if you see the UK begin to rapidly change course, which looks like it's starting to happen, it will be because they realize that mitigation is going to give way to containment, given that this higher transmission rate makes mitigation strategies ineffectual, and that ultimately we get stuck in a position because of increased CFR, which we're now seeing reporting on. We shared that from the Lancet yesterday, and increased transmission rates, which you can see from the case numbers themselves. I mean, about how fast this is spreading and the way people are moving. That ultimately, even our idea that we were going to have a quarantine and the panic that was leading up to it kind of forces us in that direction. But let's listen to Dr. Ferguson and go from here. As the COVID-19 pandemic progresses, countries are increasingly implementing a broad range of resources. Our results demonstrate that it will be necessary to layer multiple interventions regardless of whether suppression or mitigation is the overarching policy goal. However, suppression will require the layering of more intensive and socially disruptive measures than mitigation. The choice of interventions ultimately depends on the relative feasibility of their implementation and their likely effectiveness in different social contexts. And let me just interject this. What they're basically saying between the lines there is, it's no good coming up with a measure that people will be unable to follow because you defeat the purpose both ways around. And that's going to be a challenge for governments. You can't ask people to do things they won't do or it won't work, but you need to ask people to do things that will be effective. And that's why we as individuals have to be aware. We have to be responsible for ourselves, and we have to begin putting pressure on others to do so for their own safety and our own. Otherwise, we don't get out of this. We are literally dependent on our weakest link, because if we have 10% of the people constantly not following this, and they're carriers, or they have the ability to infect different people, I mean, I guess if they all get it and then they all get better or die, we'll be okay. But realistically, we don't have the time to go through that long process without having major other problems that might prove just as bad or worse if we don't address these problems first. All right, disentangling the relative effectiveness of different interventions from the experience of countries to date is challenging, because many of these have implemented multiple or all of these measures with varying degrees of success. Through the hospitalization of all cases, not those just requiring hospital care, China, in effect, initiated a form of case isolation, reducing onward transmission from cases in the household and in other settings. At the same time, by implementing population-wide social distancing, the opportunity for onward transmission in all locations was rapidly reduced. Several studies have estimated that these interventions reduced the R to below 1. In recent days, these measures have begun to be relaxed, and in fact, we've seen that they've had to shut down Chinese cities again, just saying. Close monitoring of the situation in China in the coming weeks will therefore help to inform strategies in other countries. So if you do separate absolutely everyone from everyone else, you will get your R-naught under 1. I mean, at least you should, if it's not something that's aerosolized and just endemic and you can't escape. And even with the problems we have, we're not at that point. But once again, a lot of their conclusions, and this is the problem with all of our modeling, depend upon some accuracy of the Chinese numbers, which, the more we learn, the more we doubt. I don't know how else to say it. Overall, our results suggest that population-wide social distancing applied to the population as a whole would have the largest impact, and in combination with other interventions, notably home isolation of cases and school and university closure, has the potential to suppress transmission below the threshold of R-naught of 1 required to rapidly reduce case incidence. A minimum policy for effective suppression is therefore population-wide social distancing combined with home isolation of cases and school and university closure. And I would also say, like they said earlier in the paper, that you want to have your high-risk populations really be separated from that. To avoid a rebound in transmission, these policies will need to be maintained until large stocks of vaccine are available to immunize the population, which could be 18 months or more. And we'll have some stuff on that at the end of the show. Adaptive hospital surveillance-based triggers for switching on and off population-wide social distancing and school closure offer greater robustness to uncertainty than fixed-duration interventions and can be adapted for regional use. Example, state level at the U.S. Given that local epidemics are not perfectly synchronized, local policies are also more efficient and can achieve comparable levels of suppression to national policies while being enforced for a slightly smaller proportion of the time. However, we estimate that for a national Great Britain policy, social distancing would need to be enforced for at least 2/3 of the time until a vaccine was available. And I mean, think of the economic problems of saying that the business is only going to be open 2 days a week and you don't know which ones. I mean, you're going to have supply disruptions, you're going to have shortages, and you can see why governments would be really concerned about this. And they should be. It's hard. It really is. However, there are very large uncertainties around the transmission of this virus, the likely effectiveness of different policies, and the extent to which the population spontaneously adopts risk-reducing behaviors. This means it is difficult to be definitive about the likely initial duration of measures which will be required, except that it will be several months. Future decisions on when and for how long to relax policies will need to be informed by ongoing surveillance, and by that they just mean keeping track of the number of cases. Okay, the measures used to achieve suppression might also evolve over time. As case numbers fall, it becomes more feasible to adopt intensive testing, contact tracing, and quarantine measures akin to the strategies being employed in South Korea today. Technology such as mobile phone apps that track an individual's interactions with other people in society might allow such a policy to be more effective and scalable if the associated privacy concerns can be overcome. However, if intensive NPI packages aimed at suppression are not maintained, our analysis suggests that transmission will rapidly rebound, potentially producing an epidemic comparable in scale to what we have seen had no interventions been adopted. Long-term suppression may not be a feasible policy option in many countries. Our results show that in the alternative, relatively short-term 3-month mitigation policy option might reduce deaths seen in the epidemic by up to half and peak healthcare demand by 2/3. The combination of case isolation, household quarantine, and social distancing of those at higher risk of severe outcomes, that is to say older individuals and those with underlying health conditions, are the most effective policy combination for epidemic mitigation. Both case isolation and household quarantine are core epidemiological interventions for infectious disease mitigation and act by reducing the potential for onward transmission through reducing the contact rates of those who are known to be infectious or may be harboring infection. The WHO China Joint Mission report suggested that 80% of transmission occurred in the household, although this was in a context where interpersonal contacts were drastically reduced by the interventions put in place. Social distancing of high-risk groups is predicted to be particularly effective at reducing severe outcomes given the strong evidence of an increased risk with age, though we predict it would have less effect in reducing population transmission. But they're doing that to try to prevent the healthcare system from being overrun, and we get that, and to protect, of course, the most at-risk populations. We predict that school and university closure will have an impact on the epidemic under the assumption that children transmit as much as adults even if they rarely experience severe disease. We find school and university closure a much more effective strategy to support epidemic suppression and mitigation when combined with population-wide is a more effective strategy to support epidemic suppression and mitigation when combined with a population-wide social distancing. The effect of school closure is to further amplify the breaking of social contacts between households and thus suppress transmission. However, school closure is predicted to be insufficient to mitigate, never mind suppress, an epidemic in isolation. The contrast with the situation in seasonal influenza epidemics, where children are the key drivers of transmission due to adults having higher immunity levels. The optimal timing of interventions between suppression and mitigation strategies, as well as depending on the definition of optimal, that's a weird sentence. However, for mitigation, the majority of the effect of such a strategy can be achieved by targeting interventions in a 3-month window around the peak of the epidemic. For suppression, early action is important, and interventions need to be in place well before the healthcare capacity is overwhelmed. Given that the most systematic surveillance occurs in a hospital context, the typical delay from infection to hospitalization means there's a 2 to 3 week lag between interventions being introduced and the impact being seen in hospitalized case numbers, depending on whether all hospital admissions are tested or only those entering critical care unit. In the Great British context, this means acting before COVID-19 admissions to ICUs exceed 200 per week. And to put it in the American context, since they don't put it in here, is we don't know how many people we've had. We've had hospitals asking for tests for weeks. We've had literally for months people have thought they may have had COVID, and some of them probably did. And so we don't know. So when we needed to act in a 2 to 3 week window, the CDC has basically let this proliferate for at least 8 weeks. So when people go out there with these really scary numbers of the amount of people who are sick in the U.S. and they're making these estimates, this is the basis upon which they're making a lot of those things, that they're looking at this and saying, how many people could have had this if this person got this many people sick? And we don't know, but it's really a hard question. Perhaps our most significant conclusion is that mitigation is unlikely to be feasible without emergency surge capacity limits of the UK and the US healthcare system being exceeded many times over. In the most effective mitigation strategy examined, which leads to a single, relatively short epidemic, case isolation, household quarantine, and social distancing of the elderly, the surge limits for both general ward and ICU beds would be exceeded by at least 8-fold under the more optimistic scenario for critical care requirements that we examined. In addition, even if all the patients were able to be treated, we predict there would still be in the order of 250,000 deaths in Great Britain and between 1.1 to 1.2 million in the United States. And do keep in mind, they're saying that this is the optimistic scenario. I just want to be very clear. And their estimation of 8-fold, just to put that in math for you, that would be if we had a coordinated medical effort, roughly, that increased our surge capacity to where we could handle 10 times the amount of patients. So we would get that number that we have up there, needing, millions of beds and having 160,000 available at most, then we begin to mitigate that. And this scenario they're presenting says, if we keep the healthcare workers there, if we get them the masks they need for that to happen, if the medicine supply doesn't run out, if we have the beds, if we have the ventilators, if we have a treatment protocol that works, then this is how bad it will be. Assuming that everyone does what they're supposed to do in our sort of best case scenario, we can make it so that we only have 8 times the amount of need that this will need. And so this is why I give you these horrible numbers all the time. That I looked at this, and we've looked at it, and we've gone through it in exhaustive detail where I hope you understand it. If you don't, send questions at coronaviruscast at Twitter. But that you understand the problem is that it's real simple. You are going to have the dam break, and all the cases are going to flood over the countryside, and the water's going to go into the soil. That's the sick people. That's kind of what's going to happen. The dam can process a little bit of water for a long time, right? That's how it stays in place. But if the wave is too big, if it's too strong, what happens is, at first it goes around it, and sickness is everywhere, but the dam holds. But if the pressure continues, eventually the dam breaks. And that's kind of, as a metaphor, the best way to understand what's happening with our healthcare system. And what does the dam include? Well, it includes, of course, the concrete, right? That's the capacity. And it's going to include all these other pieces, which are the ICU beds. It's going to be the medicine. It's going to be the people manning it who are figuring out how to plug the dam. All of these little pieces. And that's what they're talking about here. So, in the UK, this study continues, this conclusion has only been reached in the last few days with the refinement of estimates of likely ICU demand due to COVID-19 based on the experience in Italy and the UK. Previous planning estimates assumed about half the demand now estimated, and with the NHS providing increasing certainty around the limits of hospital surge capacity. So what they've begun to realize in the UK is how much they can't cover this and how much worse it's going to be. Typical British understatement. But it's everywhere, and this study actually, if you look at it, it goes into a little bit more detail about some of the details of where these limitations exist that fit what we've been talking about all along. We therefore conclude that epidemic suppression is the only viable strategy at the current time. The social and economic effects of the measures which are needed to achieve this policy goal will be profound. Many countries have adopted such measures already, but even those countries at an earlier stage at the epidemic will need to do so immediately. Our analysis informs the evaluation of both the nature of the measures needed to required to suppress COVID-19 and the likely duration that these measures will need to be in place. Results in this paper have informed policymaking in the UK and other countries in the last weeks. However, We emphasize that it is not at all certain that suppression will succeed long term. No public health intervention with such disruptive effects on society has been previously attempted for such a long duration of time. How populations and societies will respond remains unclear. Yeah, they don't know if they can hold it together. That's what that says. And that's on us. We now are individually very important in this equation, and we're going to make choices, and we're going to learn a lot about ourselves. I know that, I think one of the things people don't do often enough is they don't connect the big to the small. We're looking at the big picture, but it connects in two pieces. The small picture is what are you going to do to be part of the solution and to protect yourself and protect those things you care about. But in the larger picture, what are we going to do together to go ahead and prevent this? Because if we don't prevent it, what happens is the virus wins, it wrecks our society, and then we build a new society. And sooner or later, I have absolute confidence, and if you want some hope, take this. I have absolute confidence that people will get the better of this virus, and we will find the system that does this. And whatever that system looks like, I can guarantee you one thing: it's going to have to prioritize health above profit. Because if we don't do that, okay, what's going to end up happening is you're going to run right back into the meat grinder. And I should say one thing: in this study they talk about getting to the vaccine. You're going to hear a lot of that, getting to the vaccine. But remember, no class coronavirus virus has ever had a vaccine, and that we deal with something that has recombinant RNA. We're dealing with something that has different strains. Getting a vaccine in the same way that getting a flu shot may not be possible. So I think we need to differentiate our expectations and understand that if we are going to have safety out of this, if we're going to have this virus go away, we have to decide collectively at some point that in every place we can, the biggest place possible, we're just going to shut it off until it goes down. We're going to let it go away. And if you continue to make different choices, ultimately, I understand some of these balances have to be maintained, but the virus will slip through the cracks. It's what it does. It's good at it, It's designed to do that, whether naturally or otherwise. So I want to go ahead and share this piece. This is from Zero Hedge, which I think has been having very good economic analysis. I know people are concerned about that. And this was Goldman Sachs, which is one of the biggest banking investment firms out there that really is going to tell people how to act in the market, has been going out there and giving some advice. This is what they told, according to Zero Hedge, their 1,500 clients on an emergency Sunday conference call. And I just wanted to say this because this is the expectations of people who are controlling the market, and it should probably help govern what you expect. I'm not saying they're right. In fact, I think they're a little bit behind the science, and I will call out the conclusions I think are wrong. But I think it's getting closer to correct, and I think that knowing that the policymakers will be having these pressures put on them help us better anticipate what to expect. So around the time the Fed stunned markets with its 5 p.m. Sunday emergency bazooka intervention, Goldman was holding an emergency conference call to which some 1,500 clients and companies dialed in, making comparisons to Lehman Sunday, especially apropos. And they're talking about the 2007-2008 financial collapse of the mortgage subprime crisis. And maybe one day we'll go into that in detail. Suffice it to say that they were over-leveraged, and that caused a lot of problems. But for those who are wondering what Goldman said, here's the bottom line via TME. 50% of Americans will contract the virus, 150 million people, as it's very communicable. 70% of Germany will contract it. Peak virus is expected over the next 8 weeks, declining thereafter. The virus appears to be concentrated in a band between 30 to 50 degrees north latitude, meaning that, like the common cold and the flu, it prefers cold weather. I've heard a lot of people say that. I've heard people say it's a judgment that's based on the testing capacity and the reported responses. I would be very careful about drawing that conclusion, given the number of people who came from Egypt and from other environments that have been known to spread this. I think what we might be seeing there is a unfortunate example of correlation. That is to say that countries that have more advanced healthcare systems tend to be in that band of areas for reasons that are somewhat more complex than we need to cover, and that we are now looking at the fact that they're the ones reporting this as an example of this being worse. And we now see case development in the Middle East, in Malaysia, and in other places that lead us to question if that's accurate. So we'll see if that's true. And if it is true, one other thing that means is you should expect that when October comes around, September, this is going to get bad again. Let's see. Mortality rate of those impacted, 80% will be early stage, 15% mid stage, and 5% critical stage. That fits broadly what we've seen to this point, although it looks like those numbers may be expanding somewhat. We'll keep an eye on that as the data comes out of Italy. Mortality rate on average of up to 2%. heavily weighted toward the elderly and immunocompromised, meaning up to 3 million people. That number is way too low because they have no definition of surge capacity. They're basically quoting the WHO statistics. There is a debate about how to address the virus pre-vaccine. The U.S. is likely to be heading towards quarantine, and they said the U.K. is heading towards allowing it to spread. That's changing. Because, like I said, 2 days a lot can change. We have to read a lot to do this. China's economy has largely been impacted, which affected raw materials in the global supply chain. They're predicting 6 months for that to recover. They say global GDP growth will be the lowest at 30 years at around 2%. I don't know if that's right. The S&P 500 will go down 15 to 20% in the year overall. There will be economic damage from the virus itself, but the market psychology is causing the biggest damage. And in the past week, there has been a conflating impact of the virus with developing oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. Technically, the market has generally been looking for a reason to reset after the longest bull market in history, and they say there is no systemic risk. No one is even talking about that. Governments are intervening in markets to stabilize them, and the private banking sector is very well capitalized. It feels more like 9/11 than 2008. Well, of course the bank is going to say the bank is okay. We'll see what happens. This is going to be one of the stories at some point. The bank, when it says capitalized, means it has money, right? And the bank is basically showing that they have money, that they're printing out assets. And under their own financial... the way the Federal Reserve looks at the system, let's put it this way, is that their job is to make sure liquidity continues such that we have modest economic growth without having deflationary spirals. That's to say economic growth stops, or whether we have inflationary cycles where it goes out of control and therefore people start acting irrationally. They try to keep people in a narrow band of activities. The problem, as we've discussed on the show, is that we are now reaching a point where scarcity of goods due to supply chain interruptions, which is the heart of economics, and the desire that people won't want to trade because what they have is worth more than what they can get, in a situation where going out represents a real risk, which is why the governments continually downplay the virus, could in fact cause the systemic risk of having the whole system lock up. And all the liquidity in the world doesn't mean anything. It's like, what's the old saying? All the water in the world, but not a drop to drink. It's like saying you need a drink of water and the ocean is all salt. That's literally what a virus does to the way the economic modeling works. And that's one of the reasons that I am very bearish on how the market will pull through this. But I wanted to share some other pieces with you. We're going to share one other one. We're going to go into this portion of the show here, a little more detail about some of the vulnerabilities, and we're going to look at how countries are responding. This piece is from the Financial Times. U.S. and U.K. hospitals are vulnerable to surge in virus cases. Nations with large elderly populations, such as Germany and Japan, likely to be hit. This was by Kieran Stacey in Washington, Valentina Romay in London from yesterday. And I'm not going to read the whole article. We're just going to go ahead and give you a piece of it at the top, because it really does a nice job offering a comparative view of what other countries expect in terms of this... this limitation that we're going to run into about the number of people who can be treated at once due to these different problems. Especially this one looks at the ICU bed, so this will be a good baseline to give you a comparative basis from which we can view how your country is likely to do and what sort of trouble you might be in. The United States and United Kingdom both have weaknesses in their healthcare system which could trigger a collapse if the two countries experience the kind of coronavirus outbreak similar to Italy, a Financial Times analysis has found. Both countries have fewer beds per capita than most other Western nations, the analysis shows. While the U.S. and U.K. have about 2 beds per 1,000 people, Germany, by comparison, has 6, while Japan has 7.8, according to the OECD. The U.S. also lags in the number of doctors for its population with 2.6 per 1,000 people. That compares with 4.3 in Germany and 4 in Italy, where hospitals have had to erect inflatable tents in the grounds and patients in crowded corridors. And so they have a study here that shows the number of hospital beds for acute care, and countries like Japan and South Korea have between 6 to 8 per 1,000 people. A lot of the more socialized European countries have between 4 and 6. A good number of countries in Europe have around 3, and then you see other countries like the U.S. is a little bit over 2 here. Canada's at 2, Mexico's under 2, Sweden's around 2, the UK's around 2, Israel 2, is Spain, which got hit real hard, about 2.3. I'm just reading from a chart, so I'm having to kind of estimate the number for you. The U.S. has excellent diagnostic capabilities, but where it really falls short is on access to healthcare, especially for the healthcare workers themselves, said Jessica Bell, who helps compile a global health security index for the Nuclear Threat Initiative, a nonprofit that works on catastrophe prevention. Healthcare workers are beginning to sound the alarm. Hospitals in the U.S. are already quite full because of flu season. Capacity issues are being compounded by an influx of coronavirus cases. Already we are hearing of nurses having to fight to get the respirators they need. So the biggest worry is what happens when those nurses start getting sick, and we've been reporting on the fact that is starting to happen with doctors and nurses, said David Pratt, health and safety representative at the New York State Nurses Association. Japan, Germany, and Italy may also have the most capacity in their healthcare systems, but they have the oldest populations in the world. And that puts them in a uniquely vulnerable position, as statistics suggest that people over 70 are the most likely to suffer from severe complications from coronavirus, and maybe it's because of this immune weakness that they have that comes over time that is natural as we get older. Some 28% of Japan's population is aged over 65, as is 22% of Germany's. And we looked at that about a week and a half ago, saying that we didn't think the 20% number would necessarily be as important as the comorbidity number of either high age or high risk populations. And obviously there's overlap there, but we talked about how in the United States, if you use just hypertension alone, that's 103 million people. And then obesity was a huge number. So there were a lot of different things we could look at that would cause problems. All right, so one main area of concern in the United States, say experts, is patchy insurance coverage. Almost 18 million Americans did not have insurance in 2018, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, and many of those with coverage could struggle to pay their own contributions toward expensive treatments. U.S. insurers have agreed to cover the costs of testing, but they could still cost an uninsured person thousands of dollars in disease if they are hospitalized with the disease. So what you would have here is that, let's see, there's a lot of economic stuff about tourism. I'm not going to talk about that because, it's interesting, but it's not really as important for what I want to get to. So really, you have certain countries are going to be more vulnerable because of the fact that they have issues. In the United States, having all these people who are uninsured that we are still fighting over whether or not we're going to pay for and how they're going to get in there and how we're going to test these people is going to have a bigger outbreak. Honestly, I hate to say it, but this virus is going to beat the crap out of the American medical system because there's just a lack of coordination and all those levels of atomization. The fact that we have autonomous structures in theory means we can respond quickly to things we want to do, but it also means that we have a hard time coordinating in certain ways. And the fact is, I hear so many stories of people in medical systems who are waiting for guidance from above, and the fact that this administration just has not had a clear enough understanding, which we report the UK hasn't, Canada hasn't, a lot of countries haven't, but that they've been slow at the wheel is really devastating, given that we're now seeing that this thing appears to be doubling, somewhere between 3 to 5 days, depending on what numbers you're looking at, and that number continues, and we're trying to figure out and craft a policy response in the amount of time. If it's doubling every 3 days, what that means is by the time we get to next week, that we are literally, or let's put it this way, 15 days from now, we'll say it this way, if we are dealing with doubling every 3 days, that's 2 to the 5th power, we will have 32 times the amount of cases that we have today. And we obviously have a very high number, and we just keep dithering along, and I hope it isn't going that fast, and I hope we don't have those problems. But even if you have, 1,000 cases, and you're doing it 32 times, and we have a lot more than 1,000 cases, rest assured, that's when you start getting to numbers where things are in the millions, and that medical system just will not be ready for it, because they do not have the preparations in place, they do not have the ventilators, they do not have the personal protective equipment, and more importantly, perhaps, they don't have the mindset and the procedures because they've been getting incorrect information from the CDC or whatever the local health agency, maybe the NHS, Public Health England. So what happens when that happens? Well, you have to go to panic measures, right? And we sort of expected this to happen. We told how to prevent this 2 weeks ago. It didn't happen, so now we have this. This is from France 24, issued today at 2:36 a.m. France to deploy 100,000 police to enforce coronavirus lockdown. Okay. France will deploy, and this is from France 24, France will deploy 100,000 police to enforce a lockdown ordered by President Emmanuel Macron aimed at curbing the coronavirus outbreak, the country's interior minister said on Monday, and fixed checkpoints will be set up across the country. Stay-at-home Interior Minister Christophe Castanet adding that fines of up to €135 would be handed out to those flouting the toughened restrictions. Now, keep in mind what they did in Taiwan is they put a $50,000 fine and they sent you to jail for a couple of years. Not saying it's right or wrong, but you think about how people will respond to these things. In a somber address to the nation, Macron said that from Tuesday midday, and they used the example of 11 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, people should stay at home unless it was to buy groceries, travel to work, exercise, or for medical care. That travel to work thing is going to be a real fuzzy definition for a while. France had already shut down restaurants and bars, closed schools, and put ski resorts off limits, but Macron said the measures unprecedented in peacetime were needed as the number of infected people doubled every 3 days, there you go, and deaths spiraled higher. Anyone flouting the restrictions in place for at least the next 2 weeks would be punished. I know what I am asking you view as unprecedented, but circumstances demand it, Macron said. We're not up against another army or another nation, but the enemy is right there, invisible, elusive, but it is making progress. You'll notice that this warlike rhetoric is what's being employed, and all war is the total mobilization of a society to the accomplishment of one goal. That's all it is. I mean, people, it's to survive, it's to kill or be killed. And with the virus, that's where we're at. But in France, they got problems. People don't know this. There's yellow vests. They've literally been in the streets fighting the government now for weeks and months and years, actually. And it's become sort of confused what it's all about. But the social unrest is a very real thing. And dissidents are going to look at this and, look, I'm a dissident, I can tell you this. And they're going to say, can we trust? Can we do these things? And we all have to kind of put things aside for a moment, or we all will succumb to the virus. And I've been saying that. I continue to say that. That's my line. And because the virus just doesn't care. I'm not saying that these conflicts don't have validity. It's more that that's what you have to do. And France is going to be interesting to watch for that reason, to see if people will adhere to this. Because it's one thing to say the police should go ahead and quarantine people, and they're going to go ahead and say 135 people, or, put a $135 fine. But what do you do if 100 people come out and say, no, we're not going to be quarantined, we're not going to go for this? And, you have governments lying, you have governments putting out inaccurate information, you have governments just being wrong. I mean, bureaucratic ineptitude explains a lot, and that's going to be a problem in the U.S. as well, and other countries potentially, that people who do not trust the government narrative, and I understand that given their inefficacy to this point, and they don't entrust the government motive, which is more important, and that's why you have to be honest, put good information out there, and that's what we have tried to do. Okay, so he said tougher action was needed after too many people ignored earlier warnings, like the 3,500 Smurfs we told you about, not joking, and mingled in parks and on street corners over the weekend, risking their own health and the well-being of others. In France, the coronavirus has killed 148 people and infected more than 6,600. So let's just apply Macron's own logic and say they let it go there. They're at 6,600. Let's assume that's right. It's low, but let's just assume for the purposes of the conversation we are having here on Coronavirus Central, 6,600. And if they're saying it doubles every 3 days, that means they would be dealing with 26,400 cases if nothing else happened, and we don't count the lag time in there from symptomatic, assuming that those cases are active, we'd go up to 26,400. If you count the lag time and add another 2 generations in there, we'll be generous, you probably have over 100,000 cases in France. Probably. And that would fit what Ohio was projecting for themselves, which is smaller population profile, but it just shows you how much bigger that number could be, and it likely is bigger. So that's why they're beginning to act now, because they realize the numbers are going to completely swamp the health system. And at some point, if you have no health system, right, what happens? Do people just accept that people are dying, or do they demand political change? That's one of the calculations that is going to end up being a part of this story. And I suspect, at least in some countries, that it may end up being something where they decide the government's inadequate, and that social unrest breaks any quarantine measures you do, which is a weird, real contradiction. The worse it gets, the more you have to stick it out. But conversely, the people who are responsible for that, who stay in charge, are there, and what are they doing? So I don't know how it's going to play out. Nobody knows. That's what's interesting about this. And that's why we need, as people, to begin thinking not just about how we beat this disease, but what this disease can teach us about how we've structured our society, and hopefully come out of this with a better idea of how we adapt to a new world where this may not go away. Okay, Army mobilized. Under the new measures, soldiers would help transport the sick to hospitals with spare capacity, and a military hospital with 30 intensive care beds would be set up in the eastern region of Alsace, where one of the largest infection clusters has broken out. Macron said he was postponing the second round of local elections on Sunday because the government's sole focus needed to be on fighting the pandemic. He said he was suspending his reform agenda, starting with his overhaul of the pension system. The government would, when necessary, legislate by decree to fight the coronavirus. You're going to see a lot of that, and you're going to see it happen in local areas. And, I understand the issues with civil liberties. Maybe we'll do a deeper piece on that later in the week. But it's going to be a problem, especially in countries which are habituated to a large amount of freedom. And as I told someone on this interview I did, the thing is, Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, we have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can't have liberty without life, and that's why this gets complicated. Coronavirus outbreaks and infections and fatalities in France and Spain have been surging at a pace just behind that of Italy, the epicenter of the outbreak in Europe, where hospitals in the worst-hit northern regions are stretched to the breaking point. Seeking to offer further assurance to businesses, Macron said the government would offer 300 billion euros worth of loans. The loan guarantee plan would be submitted to Parliament in coming weeks and would be retroactive, a finance ministry source said. Rent and utility bills owed by small companies would also be suspended to help them weather the economic storm, he added. No French company, whatever its size, will be exposed to the risk of collapse. And, that's fine. One thing I want to say, and look, this has to happen. You need to do that for the people, too. You need to do that for the people who aren't working, who aren't employed, cover their rents, cover their mortgages, whatever you have to do to make people whole. Because if you tell people, oh, we'll cover all the mortgages but not rents, there was this horrible post on Craigslist from this property company that said, we're going to evict you in 10 days, even if there is coronavirus, if you don't pay your rent and there's nothing you can do about it. People like that are the reason why we are in the situation we're in, and it's just the lack of humanity. It's stirring to me. It's actually stunning, and you're going to see that, and if those people end up being voices that are persuasive to enough people, bad things will result, and it may not happen to them, but it will happen and extend and prolong this suffering, which will have consequences. Okay, so good news, right? We're going to go ahead and look at a piece now. This is from the Los Angeles Times, and this will show you what these all look like in an American context, right? So America does not have a full quarantine yet. A lot of stories going around, a lot of rumors about National Guard orders, shut down and be put in place. I think it's coming. I can't tell you when. A lot of people thought it would happen tomorrow. We'll see. A number of people think it will happen before the weekend. I think that it's possible they allow one more weekend for people to get to their places as shutdowns happen locally. And if you get to the point where a third or half the country is shutting down and you have regional quarantines, the federal government might just go ahead and say, since you can't get from state A to B because C is in the way, you're going to have to shut this down anyway. So I think if you don't have it by now, you're going to see it by, let's say, Monday of next week. That's not a specific prediction. Other places will go faster. San Francisco went first. Let's look at what they're doing. How the San Francisco Bay Area coronavirus shelter-in-place order works. And this is by Rongon Lin II, staff writer from the Los Angeles Times, 9:51 p.m. Yesterday. Seven counties in the greater San Francisco Bay Area region have issued a shelter-in-place order to slow the spread of the coronavirus. Here's how it works. The San Francisco Bay Area is the hardest-hit region in California with regards to coronavirus cases. More than 290 cases have been reported in the 6 Bay Area counties of Alameda, Contra Costa, Marin, San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara, as well as the neighboring county of Santa Cruz. In Santa Clara County alone, more than 130 cases were confirmed and more than 50 have been hospitalized. Officials expect the number of cases to worsen. Officials say that slowing the spread of virus is urgent to prevent hospitals from getting overwhelmed. Older adults and those with underlying medical conditions are most at risk for critical illness, with their bodies unable to fight off an infection of the lungs that can result in failure to breathe on their own, septic shock, and multiple organ failure. Some individuals who contract the COVID-19 virus have no symptoms or have mild symptoms, which means they may not be aware they carry the virus, the order said. Because even people without symptoms can transmit the disease, and because evidence shows that the disease is easily spread, gatherings can result in preventable transmission of the virus. What does the order say? Officials are directing the public to stay at home as much as possible, with certain exceptions such as to go out and get food at supermarkets, pick up prescriptions at the pharmacy, buy gas, go to the bank, and check up on relatives. You will still be able to walk your dog or go on a hike alone with someone you live with or even with another person as long as you keep 6 feet between you, said Dr. Grant Colfax, the San Francisco Director of Health, said at a press conference. We've seen that. Some countries have chosen to do that differently, so don't assume that that's going to be the case. It's going to be defined the same way. But anyway, certain essential activities are exempt, such as essential government and business services or essential public infrastructure construction like housing. Essential activities are defined below, and this is going to be arbitrary as hell, depending on what you're looking at. And this order goes into effect on 12:01 a.m. Tuesday. It will continue until 11:59 on April 7th, so they're looking at, looks like about 3 weeks there, unless rescinded earlier or extended, and I would expect that will be extended, given what we're hearing. And I'm saying right now, if you get into a quarantine, everyone's going to say it's 14 days, count on it being at least 60. I mean, there's some chance it could be 45, but given the way this peaks and curves, if they're serious about keeping it and they don't want to, the one thing the government really will not want to do is get out of a quarantine and get back into it, because that will just be so much more disruptive. They're going to keep it in for at least 60 days and maybe longer. We don't know. It depends how well it functions and how effective it is at stopping the spread. What kind of businesses are now ordered closed is all bars and nightclubs, gyms, and recreational facilities. Essential businesses are urged to remain open. A list of them are below. Are restaurants and cafes ordered closed? Restaurants and cafes can remain open for takeout and delivery only. How big can gatherings be now? All public and private gatherings of any number of people outside of a single household or living unit are now banned, with certain exceptions listed below. Let's see, what type of travel is banned? All travel, including by car and public transit, is banned, except for essential travel and essential activities, as defined below. Public transit riders should try to stay 6 feet away from others. That's kind of hard to imagine. Like, you're sitting on a subway car, a BART car, let's say, Bay Area Rapid Transit. How are you going to keep 6 feet away if you have multiple people going to work who depend on that? Shows you why cities are going to get hit pretty hard. We'll see what happens. What's going to happen, I'll tell you, is easy. People aren't going to go to work. And this is one of the interesting things of this. We're going to talk about this a lot more as we go through the rest of this episode. But one of the things you need to be aware of is that all these essential businesses, are people going to show up to work? Who's going to care for their kids? What are you going to do? And this order tries to anticipate that, but absenteeism alone is a big part of the story, the number of people who don't show up. And frankly, I can't blame people. I've been advocating from moment one to be one of those people who don't show up. Nonetheless, it's going to cause a lot of problems, because I don't think what they're offering is going to keep people safe. I don't think what they're offering is going to be enough to go ahead and protect people in the absence of having masks at a minimum for mass public consumption of people who you're putting in these vulnerable positions. And then let's say you're having kids show up at your grocery market, right? They're doing what they got to do to spread the food, but are they wearing masks? Are they given protection? Are they even told these things? To this point, no. And if they get sick, well, then you have vectors again. So you're doing all this effort for no benefit, and that's kind of what I worry about. I mean, if I had confidence that the quarantine going out there was put in with a way that kept people safe, I'd be more positive about it. And I'm not knocking what San Francisco is doing. I think it's good that they're taking these steps. I'm just telling you that what you're going to discover is they don't go far enough. And that's hard because it's going to create other problems which may prove just as critical or more critical. It's a hard spot. What about homeless people? Homeless people are not subject to this order but are urged to find shelter. That'll be a major problem in San Francisco. I don't know how they'll solve that. How will it be enforced? San Francisco Police Chief Bill Scott said police are asking the public to voluntarily comply. While violation of the health code could be enforceable as a misdemeanor, that is an absolute last resort. Scott said this is not about criminal justice approach to a public health issue. Well, look at what France just told you in the last article. They asked people to do it. People laughed it off. A week later, now they're going to start, grabbing people. So this is going to be one of the things. And the fact that they say that this is a voluntary quarantine, right? And this is the problem with a reactive mindset, right? You're going out there and you're saying it's a voluntary quarantine. People are going to go out there and say, this isn't voluntary, this is just to warm you up to it. And it's true, that's what they're doing. And then a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks from now, when the spike comes, people are panicked, things are bad. People are going to go out there and say, look, we told you it wasn't voluntary, it was mandatory, that they were doing this all along. And it's not quite as simple as that, but there's this relationship that gets confused between bureaucratic ineptitude and ill intent by people who are putting their faith and confidence in leadership that is not proven equal to it. That's why it is so important through this whole process process, that we be honest not just about what we know, but about what we don't, what we're learning, what we're trying, and why we're doing things. And I'm not taking shots at any of the public policy officials here in San Francisco. I'm simply saying that managing the expectations is a game that doesn't work well if you project truths that end up to be falsehoods, and you don't make very clear at the beginning that you think this is going to do this or that. And this idea that we need to minimize panic, it's public relations policy applied to the absolute worst principle. What we need to do is manage expectations so that people have realistic expectations. And if I have to dump the cold water on you, like I've done with this show, you can ask our listeners, go on Coronavirus Cast and ask anyone. They will tell you, I give you the bad news up front so you have time to process it, and then we work to a better solution to mitigate that. We start with the worst case scenario and we work to something better. The public policy solution has been, let's start with the best case scenario and inch toward oblivion. And no wonder people are panicking, the market's falling, because no one has realistic expectations, including our CDC and the NHS in the UK. You need to be better than that. But here's what they're trying to do. These are good things to try to stop it, and we'll see how it works. Essential activities allowed to occur, to do things essential to the health and safety of the household, including pets, getting medical supplies, visiting a clinic or hospital, or obtaining supplies to work from home. Big question. Hospitals have been the big place of spreading this. What protections do you have? If you have people going to clinics and hospitals who may or may not be sick, as opposed to going in sanitary gear for themselves or workers, you're going to have clusters. So the idea that you're going to leave just healthcare open has been a way this is spread, and is what happened in Wuhan. They need to be aware of that. I'm sure they are. I hope they're taking adequate protections, because if not, healthcare workers won't show up either because they'll be in quarantine for being sick, or they'll decide that it's not worth the risk, because they will figure this out. It's not rocket science. To obtain needed services or supplies, like buying groceries. Your stock boy who's making minimum wage is going to have an interesting decision to make. Let's see what happens. To engage in outdoor activities like walking, hiking, or running while keeping 6 feet away from others. To do work defined as essential business defined below. To care for a family member or pet in another household. To continue working for a healthcare operation like a hospital, clinic, dentist office, pharmacy, pharmaceutical and biotech company, healthcare facility, healthcare survivor, or provider, home healthcare service, mental health provider, veterinary office, or other related services. To continue working for construction projects needed for essential infrastructure, such as building housing, airport operations, work on water, sewer, gas, electrical, oil, refining, roads, highways, public transportation, solid waste collection, internet, and the telecoms. They want to keep the basic infrastructure working. That's probably important. To continue working as first responders, emergency management personnel, emergency dispatchers, court personnel, and law enforcement. Anyone needed to ensure the continuing operation of government agencies and provide for the health, safety, and welfare of the public is exempt. So who shows up in those fields, right? People at high risk for severe illness, such as the elderly and those at home with underlying medical conditions, are urged to remain home except as needed to seek medical care. So all these orders are out there, but what about the economic pressures, right? Those are answers that need to happen, and they need to happen yesterday. Congress, as usual, is taking a recess. So good for them to be not around. I almost feel like that's better, so they get out of the way and we have local solutions. But we'll talk about the problems there. They talk about what to do, health, okay. If you go out, what are you supposed to do? Stay 6 feet away from other people. The distance at which virus-infected saliva can travel in someone's cough or sneeze. Wash hands with soap or water for at least 20 seconds often, or use hand sanitizer. Cover coughs and sneezes. Stop shaking hand. And that seems to anticipate some of the aerosolization, perhaps not as strongly as it could. Number 2, other than healthcare workers and other essential workers, if you have a medical condition that puts you at risk for serious complications for the coronavirus, stay home. Number 3, for employers, take all steps needed to allow workers to work from home to the largest extent possible. Obviously, that's there. What are essential businesses? Healthcare operations, grocery stores, farmers markets, farm produce stands, supermarkets, food banks, convenience stores, other establishments that sell canned food, dry goods, fresh foods, vegetables, pet supplies, fresh meats, fish, poultry, household products, such as cleaning and personal care. Food cultivation, like farming, livestock, and fishing. I had a listener to the podcast ask, should we keep the farms going? Yeah, you should, but the problem is, you better figure out a way to make sure your people are exercising peak protection outside of that. This is a big problem, that you need people for a lot of businesses, including food, and that's what I'm most worried about going forward, because that's what tends to break systems. Businesses that provide food, shelter, social services, and other necessity for the needy, newspapers, TV, radio, and other media services, gas station, auto supply, auto repair, and related facilities, banks and related financial institutions, hardware stores, plumbers, electricians, exterminators, and other service providers whose services are necessary to safety and sanitation, businesses providing mailing and shipping services, including post office boxes, educational institutions, including public and private K through 12 schools, colleges, universities, for the purposes of facilitating distance learning or essential functions. And what they're saying there is if you have, let's say, kids at a dorm and you need to be able to feed them, that you got to figure out a way to get the food to them, and they'll figure something out. You don't want people in mass areas. So I've looked into the detail of that. Laundromats, dry cleaners, and laundry service. Restaurants and other facilities that prepare and serve food, but only for delivery or carry-out. Schools and other entities that typically provide free food services to students or members of the public may continue to do so under this order on the condition that the food is provided to students or members of the public on a pick-up and take-away basis only, and that they don't allow the food to be eaten on site. Businesses that supply products for people who need to work from home. Businesses that supply other essential business support. Businesses that ship or deliver grocery, food, goods, or services to other residences. Airlines, taxis, and other private transportation providers providing transportation services for necessary activities. So Ubers are going to keep going, but think about it. One person's out, they get sick, and you see the problem with this lockdown. They're trying to mitigate this and flatten the curve. It's a good idea, but there's so many damn exceptions that, ultimately what you're going to end up with. Well, let's go through them all, and then I'm going to tell you the problem that I see, at least, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree later. Professional services such as legal or accounting needed to assist in compliance with legally mandated activities. And child care facilities, interesting. Child care facilities providing services that enable employees exempted in this order to work as permitted. To the extent possible, they must operate under the following mandatory conditions. It must be in stable groups of 12 or fewer, meaning the same kids are together. You can't change it between groups. If more than one group is cared for at each facility, they have to be in separate rooms that do not mix. And the child care providers must remain solely with one group of children. So they seem to have anticipated the problem of needing to have child care out there. But you have all these different things, all these people moving around, all these potentials, and ultimately a real irony is happening here, which is that we have a system where the people who by and large have, I would say, let's say higher income jobs, will be the people who are at home safer from the virus, and the people who have lower income jobs, who are often making the lowest money, who are getting the least relief in this crisis, are going to be the ones that are going to be asked to shoulder the greatest risk by going out into these public jobs, like a grocery stock boy. And if you're making low income, and you have the government begin putting out measures saying that these things will be waived and these things, are those people going to show up at work, especially when people aren't going out? And I'm betting they won't. I mean, a lot of them won't. I wouldn't, I'll be honest with you, because there's an equity issue that's there, and this is why it kind of goes back to that economy-health equation, that you're trying to balance these things. You're trying to protect the economy. You're trying to protect the high productive aspects of the economy with this order, okay? And I realize this sounds a little political, but you need to understand this. And admittedly, I sound like a leftist, and I know that. That's fine. But you ultimately have to understand economy also as psychology and human motivations. That if you have one person getting protected who's not put at risk in a bad situation, and another person who's not getting helped as much put at risk, that inequity, that lack of fairness is going to lead to adjustments in behavior. And what happens when the supermarket supply boys stay home and the delivery drivers don't drive and people don't go, not only mentioned within an area, to different areas. If you're a driver, you drive, an 18-wheeler, you're out of Ely, Nevada, you're bringing food in from somewhere in the Midwest, you're not going to California, you're not picking those up. The U.S. military can pick up certain things, but this piece of people at the bottom kind of holding the whole thing up is the place that I am worried about, and that we need to be thinking about them very deeply, how to protect them, how to care for them, and that means fundamentally changing how we think about our society, and if this government cannot do that, the government that replaces it at the end of this will. And that's one of those things that's kind of interesting, that, what this virus is going to do is have us have more collective action, because if we don't do that, the virus will kill us. Either we will have cohesive units that can fight this, that consider economy and health as part of a linked equation where health is at the center of it so that people all feel they're invested, or we will continue with the atomized culture that America enjoyed that was frankly culturally and societally destructive, that is enabling the spread of this, and that has retarded the efforts to develop a effort to stop this. And I'm just saying this so that you understand the things that are coming. I could just say, let's try this and see if this works. Some people would prefer that, I'm sure. Not most of our listeners. Most of our listeners prefer to hear, this is why there's going to be a problem. There are policy solutions to that. You take care of that, and you make sure people in those positions are protected, or at least feel like they're being protected and valued. If you don't, and you just say, yeah, you got to come to work even though you're in a bad spot, some people are going to say, screw this, I'm out. And if that number gets high enough, then it doesn't matter, because you don't have food, and then you have other problems because people break the quarantine to go searching. I was reading a lot of stories from California. They were reporting from east of Sacramento, people who were coming from the Bay Area to local supermarkets to go foraging for food, basically at Safeways or Ralph's or Albertsons or whatever other supermarkets are out there. That sort of behavior happens in my neighborhood too, honestly. We've heard reports of people from Boston going well into New Hampshire and other states to look for food supplies that have not been decimated, and then they return home, if they have to. That sort of problem is consuming a lot of resources, and as I reported on the Twitter account, we saw that Kraft Heinz, I thought this was really telling, took out a $4 billion credit marker with banks. And you wouldn't think that a company that's basically out there that's producing, canned, storable food primarily, it would be the one that would be worried about the future, because you'd think they're going to have a huge market, incredible demand, and yet they're the ones who are looking for money for survival in this. And to me, that indicates that they see the logistics supply chain problem as being potentially deadly. So what is our government doing about this to help? And, I actually believe in localized solutions. I believe it's going to happen anyway. But it seems like as the Trump administration is gaining some more awareness of what's happening, and there's a series of articles, I'm not going to report on them, but if you want to look, they're curious. There's an article from Vanity Fair talking about some of the supposed internal politics of this, that certain people in the administration were tasked with working on this, specifically Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and that he saw this more as a public relations problem and an economic problem than a health problem, and that really the failure of how the government response has been that there was the reliance by the president, according to this article, on someone in his, not even in his administration really, on his son-in-law, who has been helpful with other things, who just read this wrong. So now we see the government recalibrating. And this article from The Week is from March 16th, 2020, and it's from Trump to governors in the phone call they had with all 50 of the governors. And he said, try getting respirators for coronavirus patients yourself. Governors across the United States are scrambling to make sure their healthcare systems have enough respirators to help people diagnosed with coronavirus. But President Trump surprised them Monday, telling them not to wait for the federal government, the New York Times reports. Respirators, ventilators, all of the equipment, try getting it yourself, Trump reportedly told the governors during a conference call. He did say the federal government will be backing the states, but for now they should try to resolve the issue on their own. Point of sale, much better, much more direct if you can get it yourself. Beyond that, Trump reportedly stayed on course today by sounding optimistic amid the pandemic, promising the governors were going to get it remedied and hopefully very quickly. Trump has invoked some strict travel measures since the outbreak began, but his critics have argued that he's been slow to grasp the severity of the situation, leaving the most intense measures to the states. Read more at the New York Times. Let me say two parts. Number one, I'm not happy that the federal government has seemed to be utterly flat-footed in anticipating these needs. However, I think that the advice he gives is sort of fait accompli at this point, that areas, and not just states, local areas, hospital systems, you need to be figuring out how to get ventilators and respirators. I have been told that it is possible, that you can act on it, and you need to get going, because if you're waiting for the feds to save you, I would not be in a confident position. Credit to states and medical systems who are getting in front of this, and a shame to the ones who are waiting for that direction from above. This is going to be a situation where we are going to see federalism in action, and we are going to see the failures of the federal government increase state autonomy massively, which, has pros and cons to it. It will have the advantage of having a more dynamic, hopefully more nimble response. Some areas will benefit. Conversely, we will have the problem of not having access to resources necessarily that need to come on that scale and scope, and that is going to be a problem. It looks like right now the PPE is the thing that really has health systems freaked out, that they can't get that to their workers fast enough. And, even if you have to have a handkerchief or just something. I was talking with a hospital administrator. I was saying, if you have to go ahead and figure out a cleaning protocol so you can recycle something as opposed to nothing. And these are not ideal solutions, but look, the house is on fire. You throw stuff at it, you see what works, and put it out. You can't just use the garden hose that you can count on. You're going to have to get creative, and that's where we're at. So I think that's a big part of the problem that we're dealing with here. But once again, reporting on these issues. This is from Peter Sullivan in The Hill, 3/16/20. So it was yesterday at 11:22 a.m. Washington state lawmakers warn health workers running low on protective gear. 10 members of Washington state's congressional delegation are warning that health workers are running low on protective equipment and are asking for access to the national stockpile in the fight against coronavirus. The lawmakers write in a letter to Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar they have received reports that health workers are running low on personal protective equipment, PPE. And keep in mind, in the state of Washington, we're talking about a population of 7.5 million in a country that is over 330 million. So just do really quick math. That's a little bit over 2% of the population. And they're trying to get first draw on this. I'm not blaming Washington. It's good behavior. Conversely, you start to see the scale and scope of the problem. And the reason why the feds aren't releasing it is because they don't have enough for anywhere. And whoever gets it first means everyone doesn't get it behind there. What calculations are they making about who to save? I mean, I hate to say it, but I'm sure that Seattle, Washington is not at the top of the federal government priority list. And this is why you're going to see atomization to local areas. I've said on previous shows that I think the government will do everything it can to protect New York, Washington, and Chicago. And if you're not in one of those clusters, to all the people on the West Coast listening to this, you guys are going to have to figure this out much more on your own. We can talk about that on the Wednesday evening show if people have questions why I say that. But fundamentally, the way America works is you need the government, you need the banking, and you need the food supply. Those are those three cities. California is almost like an appended nation unto itself, as is the West Coast. And take it from someone who lives in the East Coast, that people don't think of the West the same way. That doesn't mean that those people don't deserve it. It doesn't mean that a competent government should do these things. It does mean that in a risk of limited supplies, things that aren't said will be considered, and you need to begin contemplating those, how they fit into your survival method, knowing that where you live is an intimate part of how your survival goes. And so for the people out there on the West Coast and throughout the country, I would think very deeply, including the people in the South, actually, which largely seems to be not considered the way it should be, which is... I really, in fact, I'm going to take some time this week and look at what's happening down south. I haven't reported enough. People have told me there are big problems in Louisiana. We've talked about Florida. We haven't talked enough about Texas. Those are huge populations. I'm going to give you all an update because, frankly, I don't know. And the fact that I'm not hearing a lot is unfortunate because it means to me that we're not seeing enough happen. And I'm very worried for the people of Texas, Louisiana, and other major states down there. Okay, so the lawmakers write that they remain deeply concerned that the current supply of PPE is inadequate to meet the need in Washington State. As such, we urge you to fulfill requests from Washington State for the distribution of PPE for the strategic national stockpile now and in the future. They add, the letter was led by Pramila Jayapal. It includes both of the state's Democratic senators as well as one Republican lawmaker. Many health centers, nursing facilities, fire departments, and other sectors throughout the state have either depleted their supply of PPE or will run out in a matter of days. The Washington State Hospital Association has warned that its hospitals are not getting enough protective equipment, and the efforts to purchase it independently of the government have so far been unsuccessful, they added. The King County Fire Department also recently had to quarantine firefighters who were exposed to coronavirus because they did not have protective equipment. It adds that one rehab center only has equipment for another week and its vendor is out of stock. Washington State has been at the center of the coronavirus outbreak with over 600 cases and 40 deaths. And just consider how big a numbers we're talking about and how small they've actually had manifest. Experts warn there could be shortages of equipment in other states as well, especially if people do not avoid events or crowds and events are not canceled. So that tells you the shortfall that's going to be out there. I have another article here from the Financial Times. I'll put a link up to it. Not going to read it all. But politicians calling Trump to guarantee medical supplies just has a little bit more detail in this about the same basic thing that they're saying here, that this letter from the Washington State Hospital Association, And, California was trying to it has orders for 300,000, it says out there. But realistically, I mean, the consumption of this, according to standard health protocols, is just going to rocket beyond any capacity that we can actually meet. And so basically, we're in a hard spot where we're asking in this fight against the virus for our first line responders, be they nurses, doctors, emergency personnel, to take chances. And, we don't have a solution to that. Maybe the solution is, if we can't give respirators, giving full gas masks. I don't know what it is, but not having an answer is a problem. And this comes back to what we were saying was a problem in January. When you have a country where everything's built in China, right? I mean, not everything, but too many things, and you're asking to ramp up manufacturing capacity in the middle of a pandemic, you're not going to see that happen. And our response from our government was to throw money at the problem, saying, hey, we got the economy covered, we're going to take care of this. And even with respect to what we've thought for solutions, is basically they threw money at biotech looking for a cure to this. Well, a cure 18 months from now, if it happens, which I'm skeptical of, is not going to help all the people who are going to suffer today. And you're going to see, to the extent this is an ongoing equation, that people don't feel safe going to hospitals, not just patients, but the doctors and the nurses themselves. You're going to have a major problem be ongoing here. So, man, I've been talking a lot today. 2 hours, 3 minutes, Coronavirus Central. But this is important. This is the crisis time where if we don't change things and change our behaviors, we'll be in big trouble. So we're going to run long today. I apologize. I know people, want the information. I'm sorry that there's a lot out there. I have to give you a lot of analysis. And we're going to try to get through it. I probably got about another 20, 30 minutes left, and then we'll try to end up the show. And then, I get up and do it again every day. A lot of people ask how you could help out. We're going to try to have a website up. We'll have some super chats on Google. It's a way to get money. Getting electronic money would be real easy, but it's not easy for me for reasons that are long and complicated. So if you ever want to send some support, P.O. Box 35, Greenville Junction, Maine, 04442. It helps. It lets me stay in the air. I'm not asking for money you don't have. But if you want to throw a couple bucks my way, it helps out. So actually, I had to spend some this morning to subscribe to the Financial Times because it was there were just too many articles I needed to know, and you guys need to know some of this information. So I'm not gonna let money keep me from doing what's necessary now. I've chosen health, and I'll deal with the consequences on the other side of this, as will we all. This article is from Vice. I wanted to share this. This is from March 14th by Lauren Kaori Gurley. Amazon Prime will falter during the coronavirus crisis, experts say. And a lot of people are counting on the quarantine to work by saying, I'm going to order stuff and it's going to come to me. But a lot of things can go wrong with this, and we're going to look in exhaustive depth at Amazon as the sort of exemplar of what is going to happen for other entities. We'll talk about, Walmart, all of these sort of things. But also there are supply chains that exist within retailers. So if you're working at a supermarket or you go to whatever your big box store is there, I mean, if you leave those open as areas and there are people rushing to there, especially as they will if shortages of supplies happen, this quarantine just isn't going to work. So you got to get the food out, and you're going to have to try to get it direct to site to the individuals where they live. But can Amazon deliver? And look, don't expect a 2-day delivery. That stuff is going out the window, okay? And be realistic. There are people behind this, and working at Amazon, there's a lot of articles going back a long way that describe it, and I don't mean to be mean, as a literal hellscape in terms of how they treat their employees. There's a lot of back history on that, and now you're asking people to risk that in an environment where people are getting sick. We know that at least one Amazon worker already got sick at their Seattle warehouse, and beyond the risk to ourselves, the risks that they are willing to incur. So let's talk about the supply chain issues, and then we're going to talk about some details. We're going to get really granular because one of the things we try to do on this show is we look at key vulnerabilities in the system and allow you to see the evidence of what's happening and make your own assessment about the risks involved so you can make intelligent preparations for your family about what needs you need to anticipate and what goods and services will or will not be available in the future. All right. More than half of American households are Amazon Prime members, and for better or worse have come to rely on the service for many of their everyday needs. In the coming weeks and months, as coronavirus continues to spread, many Americans holed up in their homes and apartments for the purposes of quarantine or social distancing will rely increasingly on Amazon's delivery services to fill up all their material needs. This will undoubtedly put increased strain on the workers who pack and deliver Amazon products and leave them vulnerable to COVID-19. Motherbird spoke to Amazon logistics and labor experts who say it's only a matter of time before Amazon's Prime's signature 2-day delivery promise faces serious delays, mistake, and widespread shortages due to increased demands from consumers, pressure on workers to meet rising production quotas, restrictions on trade, and the possibility of fulfillment centers being shut down as coronavirus spreads. Amazon's warehouse workers say they're already seeing increased workloads, while fewer of their colleagues are showing up to work, according to labor organizers. Already, Amazon's white-collar workers have been asked to work from home, but that's not obviously an option for warehouse fulfillment workers and delivery drivers. It seems really likely that Amazon's Prime's delivery system will falter. Daniel Flaming, the president of Economic Roundtable and author of the 2019 report on Amazon's economic impact on Southern California, told Motherboard, one day deliveries may not be made within one day. If the workers who do show up to warehouses are more stressed and given bigger routes or possibly less experienced, incorrect deliveries will be made. The last mile segment of the delivery is very labor intensive. Flaming adds that we are likely to see a close parallel of what happens in Amazon warehouses during the holiday rush. Increased delays, mistakes, and bottlenecks. It would seem to me most likely we'd see a drop in reliability and timeliness. But keep in mind, not only do we have those issues, but we also have the supply shortage, right? That things haven't been coming in from China, and we were saying in January this was going to end up being a problem in around March. Here we are, here it is. With the coronavirus crisis having already affected large swaths of the American culture and economy, there's no real reason to think that the world's largest retailer will be spared. Amazon is facing pressure from 3 different sides. Increased demand from consumers, the very real potential of coronavirus spreading through a warehouse, and supply chain interruptions. Ports that receive goods from overseas have seen major slowdowns as the Chinese stall manufacturing. While Trump's European travel ban does not currently include trade, imports from Europe could come to a halt if things change as they already are overnight, and that's happening, basically, for reasons that have to do with the virus more than governmental intent. Already, Amazon is seeing shortages of basic supplies like toilet paper, hand sanitizers, and disinfectant wipes. Yeah, they've been gone. Masks have been gone. You're not getting those. There has been a tremendous slowdown at our ports. It was picking up again a little, but it's going to drop off again, said Barbara Maynard, a spokesperson for the Teamsters International Ports Division, which handles truck drivers and port workers who handle Amazon products. At any moment, our borders and ports could be closed. That will probably happen. There's a tremendous amount of fear among workers we organize who handle Amazon products. On March 11th, Amazon announced it would provide all of its employees and contractors with 2 weeks paid sick leave and unlimited paid time off, and established a $25 million relief fund for its gig workers and contractors. I want to tell you something, though, but Amazon literally went out, I'm not even making this up, a week ago. They went and said that you should help fight the coronavirus epidemic by giving some of your paid sick leave to another worker. I mean, how friggin' selfish. I mean, Bezos is the richest man on earth, and he still wants to go deeper into this. It's absolutely crazy. And, you judge for yourself what you think people will conclude from that level of treatment. I mean, if you're a Whole Foods user, okay, and you're someone there, you tell me how much different it is in terms of how things are handled as opposed to before Amazon bought it, I don't know, that's going to be a problem. But in any case, the health and safety of our employees and contractors around the world continues to be our top priority as we face the challenges associated with COVID-19, an Amazon spokesperson told Motherboard. Leaders across Amazon are meeting every day to consider the evolving situation and are consulting with medical experts to ensure we are doing all we can do to keep our teams healthy. We've taken a number of actions over the past few weeks and will continue to evaluate next steps should we see a much broader impact. But among labor experts and warehouse workers, there's widespread concern that Amazon has not done enough to protect its workers and customers from getting sick at some point in the supply chain. According to researchers, the virus can live on cardboard for up to 24 hours. What we're seeing right now from Amazon is pretty bad. Zachary Lerner, Director of Labor Organizing at the New York Communities for Change, who organizes Amazon warehouse workers in Staten Island, told Motherboard. Right now, they're offering unlimited unpaid time off, but if workers need to make money, they still need to go into work, which will spread coronavirus at the vector points. What they have put together right now doesn't address worker health or societal health. In order to address this, any worker who is sick must be compensated with paid sick leave for the time they spend away from the job. Given the demand on Amazon, what are they saying here? Sorry about this. They put this together kind of weirdly. So they put a quote, in the distribution center where people pick up their loads, there's a lot of interaction between people within close range of each other. Given the demand on Amazon as it is now, the intense pace of work inside these facilities, and the delayed announcement about any paid time off, the people who work for and live around Amazon, people who have very reasons to be very worried and are very angry, said Dania Rajendra, the director of Athena, a coalition of several dozen grassroots organizations that formed in late 2019 to challenge Amazon. To whatever extent they've planned, Amazon management seems to not have taken into consideration the humanity and needs of the people who make Amazon successful. During a recent petition for paid sick leave and child care accommodations during the pandemic, created by Amazon warehouse workers in Queens, workers wrote, "We have seen an increase in the volume of such goods, placing a greater strain on workers. Yet, despite larger workloads, Amazon continues to enforce and raise productivity quotas. At the same time, many workers have been shocked to discover that the company has been illegally denying them paid sick leave." And when half of America is counting on this company to do this, this is a major problem. Because if Amazon goes down, what will happen is there will be all sort of cascading pressures that will wreck the last mile supply chain. That's how things get to your house. I mean, there's a lot of things, getting things to a box store that's not so bad, but getting things individually out there really depends on Amazon. And Amazon is leaning hard into people who really don't have to take it, and we'll see if they do. It's true that a lot of people will rely on Amazon. It will mean lots of pressure on the workforce, delivery drivers who will be delivering hundreds of packages a day. I think this applies to UPS too a little bit, said Tim Shadix, legal director at the Warehouse Worker Resource Center, which organizes warehouse workers in Southern California. Workers have said before that performance pressures make it difficult for some people to follow safety rules or take bathroom breaks. You have to wonder how people will slow down and wash their hands, especially delivery drivers in the field. Experts say that warehouse workers and last-mile delivery drivers are particularly at risk because they're in close contact with packages that have been in the hands of others at different stages in the logistics chain. In the distribution centers where people pick up their loads, there's a lot of interaction between people within close range of each other, said Flaming, the president of the Economic Roundtable. People are in close contact with packages that have been handled by many other people. They're at risk of being caught up in a chain of infection. When an Amazon warehouse worker inevitably gets coronavirus, labor experts and organizers told Motherboard that it's unclear whether Amazon will respond by pausing operations, which would disrupt the flow of goods to customers, or simply go on with business as usual, but it's likely Amazon will follow safety recommendations prescribed by the government. So what's that mean when they have to shut down the whole warehouse, right, to decontaminate? I think we would hope that Amazon would follow what guidelines are recommended from OSHA and CDC, including slowdowns or shutdown, said Shadix, the legal director at the Warehouse Worker Resource Center, which organizes Amazon warehouse workers. I have no reason to think that Amazon would ignore the recommendations of health experts. We'll have to wait and see what everyone else does. Amazon told Motherboard it has increased in intensity and frequency of cleaning at all its work site, requires employees to stay home when they're sick, and required the employees clean their workstations and vehicles and disinfect them in their vehicles at the start and end of every shift. So that's what they're saying to you. And honestly, so there's a piece, I'm not going to read the whole detail here. This is from Dave Lee in San Francisco yesterday. Amazon says it will hire 100,000 extra staff. E-commerce giant will also raise hourly demands as it tries to keep pace with coronavirus demand. And they're saying that they want to have, not including contractors, that would basically increase their workforce from 800,000 to 900,000. They want to increase the hourly wage. They're going to increase at the end of April the wage by $2 per hour there, and the warehouses are operational. I'm just reading real fast through here. So they are having temporary disruptions with Whole Foods. So you ask me, in the middle of a quarantine, given that that's where everyone can go be rushing and not even have time for a bathroom break, how many people you think are going to jump to take those Amazon jobs, especially as governments get involved and tell people to stay home? But if they don't, you're going to have this supply chain shortage. It's other pretty much inevitable, and you're going to see this go down. So let's go here. I'm going to read you a piece here that is from Reddit, okay? Which I'm just reading this as a story, and this was by a person who was on there. I'll put the link up for you can see it. Just a person who claims to be a worker at Amazon and gives an inside detail of what they believe is happening, okay? So, and they posted this 23 hours ago. It's called An Argument for Calling Out Sick. The person claims, and I share this because I think this is a realistic portrayal of what people are facing, and, I don't want to get the person in trouble, so I'm just going to share it, and you give what weight to it, what you want to, okay? I am in leadership at a Seattle Whole Foods location, and tomorrow I am encouraging my team to call out sick regardless of their current health. I am no longer comfortable asking them to show up for work. My hands are bleeding from washing and sanitizing. My eye won't stop twitching, maybe from stress, maybe from a steady intake of Giants NA, I guess that's a product. Each time Governor Inslee shuts down another sector of business, another wave of scared shoppers flood the store. Comps are insane. Whole Foods Market is profiting handsomely off the consumer hysteria. Stakeholders, our CEO, and the people at the top are making money hand over fist from the safety and comfort of their Laurelhurst cottages, while we work harder and longer on the front lines and ground zero of the American COVID outbreak. The ladies from TMS won't step foot in the store. They are where the CDC recommends they should be, at home. Regional is working from home. Global is working from home. The entire city is either working from home or not working at all. They are isolating, except for one instance, to visit our stores. While the rest of the city is reducing their exposure and therefore their risk, we are in the unfortunate position of putting ourselves on the front line of exposure. Besides the medical industry, grocers and pharmacists are the very last to shutter the doors. The medical industry has assumed risk and are compensated appropriately. Pharmacist salary estimate for Seattle is $110,000 to $114,000 yearly. How the hell am I supposed to tell some cashier to show up and subject themselves to this for $16.90 an hour? From the COVID-19 playbook published by Whole Foods, the health and wellness of all our suppliers, customers, and team members remain our top priority. We appreciate your cooperation, understanding, and partnership during this challenging time. Thank you. From the Centers of Disease Control, COVID-19, how to prepare